Story of courage, betrayal, and the family nobody saw coming. Parking garage was nearly empty at 7:14 on a Tuesday evening. Mason Kincaid heard the scream before he saw anything. 2 seconds, maybe less. But his body had already moved, not because he thought about it, not because he made a decision. Something buried so deep inside him, it had no name, simply took over. His hand shot out to grab Tyler's shoulder, and the boy barely had time to register confusion before Mason was pushing him toward the security door, his voice steady and quiet in a way that left no room for argument. Stay behind that door. Call 911. Do it now. And then Mason Kincaid, retired Navy SEAL widower, father of a 7-year-old boy, part-time school volunteer, man who drove a dented Ford with a cracked dashboard and a Pine air freshener, ran toward the sound. Before we go any further, if you're watching this story for the first time, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next, because this is the kind of story that gets harder to put down with every chapter. Drop a like if you're already invested, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that parking garage. The city had that particular kind of cold that December carried well, not the soft, romantic cold of greeting cards, but the kind that crept under your collar and made the air taste like metal. The downtown shopping center had been buzzing all evening with holiday foot traffic, families hauling shopping bags, teenagers taking up the elevator, older couples walking slowly and not minding it. Seasonal music leaked out of every storefront, the kind of noise that settled into background and disappeared. Mason had been ready to leave for 40 minutes before Tyler finally allowed himself to be pulled away from the toy section. The boy had pressed his forehead against a display case and cataloged every item inside with the focused intensity of a small engineer reviewing blueprints. Mason had stood behind him, hands in his jacket pockets, watching him with the quiet exhaustion of a man who had been doing this alone for 3 years and had mostly made peace with it. Pick one, Mason said finally. Not two, one. But what if I can't decide? Then I pick for you. Tyler straightened immediately. The robot. Mason bought the robot. They walked to the parking garage on the east side of the building, the kind of structure that cities build when they have enough money to build it, but not enough to light it properly. Levels connected by narrow ramps. Concrete columns spaced close enough together to create shadows in every direction. The fluorescent strips overhead hummed and occasionally flickered in that way that nobody ever fixed, because it was never quite broken enough to justify the work order. Their car was on the 3rd level. Mason always parked on the 3rd level, same row if he could manage it, same general section. Old habit. Know your exit, know your terrain. They had just come off the elevator when Mason heard it. Scream, short, sharp, and immediately cut off. Not a startled sound. Not someone who dropped something or slipped. He had heard enough of both varieties in enough different contexts to know the difference. This was a sound that a person made when the air was forced out of them, by fear, by hands, by the sudden understanding that something was happening to them that they had not chosen and could not stop. He heard it, and his body moved before his brain caught up. To his left, maybe 40 yards down the row, a black SUV sat running with its side door hanging open. A woman in a dark business coat was twisted sideways against the door frame, one hand gripping the roof of the vehicle, the other pushing against the chest of a man who was perhaps 6 feet tall and wearing a dark jacket with the hood drawn up. He was not trying to reason with her. He was trying to move her. His arm had come around her waist, and he was leveraging his weight against her resistance, steady and practiced, the way someone moves when they have thought through the mechanics of what they are doing. Mason registered the scene in less than 2 seconds. He registered something else in that same window of time, the boy beside him. Tyler. His voice came out calm, controlled. Tyler looked up from the robot box and immediately understood from his father's face that something had shifted. Kids were like that. They read tone better than words. You see that security door we passed? The gray one with the yellow stripe? Yeah, you're going to walk to it right now. Don't run. Walk. Go inside and find the guard. Tell him there's a problem in the garage and you need him to call 911. Can you do that? Tyler was 7. He was also the son of a man who had, in quiet ways over 3 years, prepared him for the possibility that emergencies happened and panic was not useful. Yeah, Tyler said. I can do that. Good man, go. Tyler went. Mason turned back toward the SUV. Later, when people asked him what was going through his mind, reporters, police officers, eventually Serena herself, he never had a satisfying answer. There was no internal monologue, no dramatic steeling of resolve, no moment where he decided to be brave. It was more like a door that had been locked for years simply came open, and whatever had been waiting behind it stepped out and took over. He moved along the row of parked cars, keeping the columns between himself and the SUV for as long as possible, closing distance without being seen. The man had managed to get the woman halfway into the vehicle and was using the doorframe as leverage, his body blocking her from gaining purchase on anything solid enough to pull herself free. She was fighting. That mattered. She had not gone limp or passive. She was using her elbows, twisting her weight, trying to find angles. One heel had caught the runner of the doorframe, and she was using it to brace herself, which was slowing him down considerably. Whoever she was, she hadn't stopped trying for a single second. Mason came around the last column and covered the final 10 feet fast. He didn't announce himself. He didn't give a warning. He grabbed the man's jacket collar with both hands and used his own momentum to pull him backward and off balance, rotating the grip so that the man's shoulder was suddenly at the wrong angle and his feet were no longer reliably under him. The man was big and he was fast, and he recovered quickly enough but spun around a blow that Mason partially blocked, but the critical thing had already happened. The woman had tumbled sideways out of the doorway and caught herself against the car parked next to the SUV, and she was no longer inside the vehicle. The man and Mason exchanged approximately 4 seconds of contact that Mason would later describe to police as a brief interaction. In those 4 seconds, Mason broke the man's grip, took a hit to the ribs that would leave a bruise for 2 weeks, and drove him back hard enough against the SUV's open door that the sheet metal buckled slightly and the man's breath came out in a grunt. Somewhere in the building, a siren had begun. The man looked at Mason's face. Something he saw there, something in the eyes, maybe, or in the complete absence of panic, made a calculation complete itself. He shoved Mason back, grabbed the SUV's door, and got behind the wheel. The vehicle was already moving before the door fully closed, tires screaming on the concrete ramp, the sound bouncing off every wall on the way down. Mason stood in the echo of it for a moment, breathing. Then he turned around. She was standing against the parked car, her business coat torn at one shoulder, her dark hair half fallen from whatever arrangement it had been in. She was holding herself together with visible effort, arms crossed, jaw set, eyes doing the thing that people's eyes did when they were running a very fast internal calculation about whether they were going to cry or not, and had decided against it. She was also, Mason noticed, studying him with an expression that went slightly beyond gratitude. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." She paused. "My shoulder's going to bruise." "Are you sure you're not hurt anywhere else?" I said no. Her voice came out sharper than she perhaps intended. She looked away briefly, and when she looked back, her expression had changed. "I'm sorry." She stopped. Exhaled. "Thank you." "I don't that was." "Thank you. Security is coming," Mason said. "Police too, probably. My son's inside." She blinked. "Your son, 7. He knows the protocol." She stared at him. "You sent your 7-year-old son to call the police, and then you came over here, and He was fine," Mason said. "He's good in a crisis." "He's 7. He handles it better than most adults." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. The approaching sirens were getting louder. From down the ramp, Mason could see a flashlight beam swinging the security guard, probably with Tyler close behind him. Mason took a step back. The instinct was old and automatic. Get clear of the center. Reduce your footprint. Let the professionals do the work they were arriving to do. "Wait," she said. He looked at her. "I don't even know your name." He thought about it, not for long. "Mason." "I'm Serena," she said. He nodded. He knew who she was, had recognized her from newspaper photographs and the occasional business section article, but he didn't say so. It seemed beside the point. The security guard arrived in a rush of breath and radio static. 2 police cruisers were already audible in the structure below. Tyler appeared from behind the guard's shoulder, located his father with his eyes, and then walked over with the measured calm of someone who had done his job correctly and was now ready to be told what happened next. Mason put his hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Good job. he said quietly. The guard wouldn't let me come back up at first, Tyler said. I had to explain twice. You explained it twice, and it worked. That's fine. For the next 40 minutes, Mason answered the police officer's questions with the minimal accuracy of a man who had learned long ago that thorough explanations invited follow-up questions he'd rather not have. He gave his name, his contact information, a description of the man and the vehicle, a straightforward account of what he had done and why. He left out nothing material and embellished nothing. When a young officer asked what he did for work, Mason said, "Nothing interesting." The officer let it go. Serena was on the other side of two police vehicles, speaking with a detective. Mason could see her from where he stood. She was composed now, the visible shaking from the immediate aftermath gone, her voice steady as she walked someone through whatever she was telling them. A man in a suit who had arrived in a separate vehicle, her assistant maybe, or corporate security, stood nearby looking slightly panicked in a way she herself was not. A news van appeared at the garage entrance, then another. Mason saw them before anyone else seemed to notice, and he was already moving Tyler's hand in his, cutting sideways between parked vehicles toward the far stairwell, heading for the lower level where he'd had enough foresight to park that evening. "Dad," Tyler said, keeping pace. "Aren't we supposed to stay? We gave our information. They have everything they need. The reporters don't need anything from us. They made it down 2 flights and out a side exit without incident." Mason unlocked the Ford, got Tyler settled in the back seat with the robot box, and drove out of the garage through the exit on the far side of the building. He merged onto the street calmly, checked his mirrors twice, and then settled into the normal pace of city traffic heading home. After a while, Tyler said, "Was she okay? She's okay." Who was she? Someone who needed help. The boy thought about this for a block or two, watching the city slide past the window. "Are you going to be in trouble? For being in a fight?" "I wasn't in a fight," Mason said. "A fight is when 2 people want to be involved." That was something else. What was it? Mason considered the question seriously, the way he always did when Tyler asked something that deserved more than a deflection. "Necessary," he said finally. Tyler nodded as though this made complete sense, which perhaps to a 7-year-old it did. They drove the rest of the way home with the radio on low, a station that played old country music, because Tyler had recently decided he liked old country music for reasons Mason could not entirely explain. The city gave way to the quieter residential streets of their neighborhood, the houses close together and lit from inside, with the yellow warmth of people moving through their evenings. Dinner being made, television on, dogs waiting at front doors. Mason pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. He sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel. His ribs ached. The bruise from the elbow would announce itself fully by morning. Under the dome light, he could see the scuff on his jacket where the man had grabbed him. He would need to check if the seam was torn. None of this was what occupied his mind. What occupied his mind was the look on her face when she had turned from the car and first seen him. Not the gratitude which had come afterward. The first thing. The raw, unfiltered, completely unguarded expression of someone who had been terrified and was suddenly, unexpectedly not. He had seen that expression before, in different circumstances, different places. He had spent years in environments where fear was the baseline condition and relief was the rarest thing available. But he hadn't seen it in a long time, and there was something in the seeing of it now here, in a parking garage in his own city, on a freezing Tuesday in December, that had moved through him in a way he didn't have clean words for. "Dad," Tyler said from the back seat, "can I open the robot inside?" Mason pulled himself back. "Yeah," he said, "inside." They went in. Mason made grilled cheese because it was late, and neither of them wanted anything complicated. Tyler opened the robot on the kitchen table and immediately began explaining its components in elaborate detail to an audience of 1. Mason ate half his sandwich and listened, and around the edges of the listening he was somewhere else, turning over something he wasn't ready to examine directly. He washed the dishes. He got Tyler through his bedtime routine and into bed. He checked the locks on the front and back doors twice, which was not unusual for him. He made himself a cup of coffee he didn't particularly need and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet. Somewhere across the city, a woman named Serena Vale was answering questions in a police station, or being driven to her home by security personnel, or standing in some well-lit office trying to make sense of an evening that had taken a hard turn toward something she had not been prepared for. Mason didn't know her. He had recognized her face and her name from newspapers, and he knew the basic outline of what she had built, some technology company that had grown faster than anyone expected, a founder who had appeared on enough magazine covers that her face was part of the city's general visual vocabulary. That was all. But he knew, in the clear-headed way that certain kinds of experience teach you to read certain kinds of situations, that what had happened tonight had not been random. The man in the garage had been prepared. He had known where she would be. He had chosen a location with compromised lighting and a vehicle already running and a door already open. He had brought someone with him. Mason was fairly certain there had been a second person, somewhere further back, watching the approach, and he had operated with the specific kind of calm that came not from bravado, but from planning. Someone had organized that. And Serena Vale, for all the competence she had shown in that garage, holding herself together and fighting back, and answering a detective's questions without falling apart. Serena Vale was not going to be able to see what Mason had already seen. The night settled in around the small house. The furnace clicked. The refrigerator hummed. Mason sat at his kitchen table with his coffee going cold, and the kind of quiet that had become his life spread out in every direction around him. He had done the right thing tonight. He was certain of that. He had done what needed to be done, and then removed himself from it the way he always did, the way he had learned to do. Clean action, clean exit, minimal footprint. That was the plan. That was the life he had built after everything else had ended. He picked up his coffee cup, found it cold, and set it down again. Outside, somewhere in the dark, the city kept making its ordinary noise. And Mason Kincaid sat in his kitchen and had the particular uncomfortable feeling of a man who suspects that the quiet, controlled life he has constructed very carefully around himself has just, without warning, developed a crack. The news cycle ate the story and moved on in less than 48 hours. That was how it worked now. Something dramatic happened. Cameras showed up, anchors spoke gravely into microphones for a news cycle or two, and then something else happened somewhere else, and the first thing dissolved back into the noise. By Thursday morning, the parking garage incident had been reduced to a brief paragraph in the city's online news feeds, attempted abduction of local tech CEO thwarted by bystander, suspect at large, investigation ongoing, and by Friday it had disappeared entirely from the front page. Serena Vale did not disappear from it so easily. She sat in her office on the 14th floor of the Vale Technologies building Thursday morning, with a cup of coffee she had not touched and a view of the city she was not looking at, and she thought about the man in the parking garage. Not in a sentimental way, in the way that a precise and analytical mind returns to a data point that doesn't fit the expected model. She had been in enough boardrooms and enough difficult negotiations to know when something was off about a situation and something was very off about Mason Kincaid. Normal people, good people, decent people, people who saw someone in trouble and wanted to help, did not move the way he had moved. They hesitated. They pulled out their phones. They called out from a safe distance. They did the calculation between involvement and safety and came down somewhere in the middle, which was where most reasonable human beings landed, and there was nothing wrong with that. He had not done any of those things. He had handed his 7-year-old son a job and walked toward the problem without breaking his stride. And then he had left before anyone could thank him properly. Ms. Vale, her assistant, Priya, appeared in the doorway holding a folder. The detective called again. Detective Rourke. He wants to schedule the follow-up for this afternoon, if you're available. Tell him 3 o'clock, Serena said, and Priya the man from the garage. Mason Kincaid. I asked you to get me a contact number. Priya's expression shifted in the small way it did when she had information she wasn't sure Serena would like. He's not easy to find. He's not on any of the usual platforms. No LinkedIn, no social media presence I can locate. Police report has a home address and a phone number, but I wasn't sure if you wanted me to use that. I want you to use that. He didn't seem interested in being found, Priya said carefully. No, Serena agreed. He didn't. Get me the number anyway. She called him herself, which was not something she typically did, because typically there were people who made calls on her behalf. But this felt like something she needed to do directly, and when the phone rang 4 times and she was already preparing to leave a voicemail, he picked up.
Yeah.
His voice was the same as it had been in the garage. Flat, unhurried, not particularly warm. "This is Serena Vale," she said. "I'm calling to thank you properly. I don't think I managed it the other night." A pause. "Not a long one. You managed fine. I'd like to do it in person. If you're willing. I can come to you. I don't need you to come downtown." Another pause, slightly longer. "That's not necessary." "I know it's not necessary," she said. "I'd still like to." He didn't say yes immediately. She noticed that. Most people, when she asked for something directly, said yes before she finished the sentence. Whether out of eagerness or intimidation or simple social reflex, they said yes. He sat with it for a moment in silence, as though he was actually thinking it through rather than performing the thought. "Saturday morning," he said finally. "Early is better. My son has a thing at 11. "Early is fine," she said. 9? 9 works. He gave her the address without making her ask for it, which she appreciated, and hung up without the usual closing niceties people attach to phone calls when they were talking to someone they wanted to impress. He did not say it was no problem, or that he was glad she'd called, or that he looked forward to seeing her. He said goodbye and hung up. Serena held her phone for a moment after the call ended and felt something she hadn't expected, which was the mild and slightly ridiculous sensation of being slightly off balance. She put the phone down and went back to the coffee she hadn't touched, and this time she actually drank some of it. The detective arrived at 3 o'clock with a partner and a yellow legal pad, and the specific quality of patience that experienced investigators carried the understanding that people disclose things at their own pace, and the job was mostly to be present while that happened. Detective Rourke was in his early 50s, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been lived in for a while. His partner, a younger woman named Chen, took most of the notes. "We've made some progress on the vehicle," Rourke said. "It was a rental. Cash transaction at a location across town, fake ID. The man on the surveillance footage from the rental agency matches the description you gave us and what we have from the garage cameras." "Then you have footage of him," Serena said. "We have footage of him in a hood at the rental agency and partial footage of him in the garage. Not great angles. We're working with what we have." He paused. "Ms. Vale, I want to ask you something directly, and I'd appreciate a direct answer." "All right. Is there anyone in your professional life who might have reason to want to harm you or remove you from your position?" She had been expecting the question. She had been sitting with her own version of it since Wednesday morning. "Company is growing fast," she said. "Fast growth makes people nervous. There are board members who think I'm overextending. There are competitors who would benefit from disruption at Vale Technologies. There are investors who have expressed concerns about the direction I've chosen." She paused. "That's a fairly long list. Anyone specific?" She thought about the question carefully. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer she had was one she hadn't fully decided what to do with yet. "I'd need to think about it more before I pointed you in any specific direction," she said. "I don't want to create problems for someone based on a feeling." Rourke studied her for a moment. "Ms. Vale, someone organized this. The driver, the location, the timing your regular security driver called in sick that day, which is why you were in the garage without an escort. It's not a coincidence we're treating as a coincidence." The room felt slightly colder. She had known in the back of her mind that the sick driver was relevant. She had noted it Wednesday morning and filed it in the part of her brain that collected unpleasant facts and held them for later examination. Hearing Rourke say it out loud was something different. "Someone knew my schedule," she said. "Someone knew quite a bit about your routine," Rourke confirmed. "Which means someone with access to that information was either involved or compromised." After the detectives left, Serena sat alone in her office for a long time. The city below her moved in its ordinary patterns, indifferent to the fact that she was sitting 14 floors above it, trying to figure out who inside her own company might want her gone. She had built Vale Technologies from a rented desk in a shared co-working space when she was 24 years old. She had spent 6 years sleeping 4 hours a night and making decisions that scared her, and hiring people she trusted, and firing people she'd trusted incorrectly and starting again. The company had grown from 8 employees to nearly 400. She knew most of their names. She had written personal notes to their families when things went wrong in their lives. She had done the work, not just because she wanted to succeed, though she did want that, badly, in the competitive and unapologetic way that she'd stopped pretending to be ashamed of, but because she believed in what the company was building. And now someone inside that structure might have tried to have her taken. She pulled up her internal access logs and looked at them for a long time. Then she closed the file, put her phone in her bag, and went home. Saturday arrived cold and clear. She drove herself, which she did when she needed to think without someone else in the car, and followed the GPS to a residential street that was quiet in the specific way that streets were quiet when the people who lived on them were not particularly interested in being noticed. Modest houses, close together, small yards, a city street that had aged gradually and honestly without trying to become something it wasn't. The house was a gray-blue, two-story, with a covered porch, and a driveway containing one dented Ford pickup and one child's bicycle with training wheels still attached, though the child who rode it appeared to have outgrown them. Parked at the curb and sat for a moment. She had brought nothing, which felt slightly wrong and also felt correct. What did you bring to the home of a man who had walked toward a kidnapping on your behalf and then disappeared before you could process what that meant? She had briefly considered a bottle of wine before remembering he'd mentioned his son, and then considered flowers before recognizing that flowers communicated something she wasn't sure she intended, and had ultimately arrived empty-handed and decided that was fine. She knocked. Footsteps from inside, two sets, one heavier, one quick and light. The door opened, and there was Tyler, slightly taller seeming in his own house than he had looked in the garage, wearing a sweatshirt with a dinosaur on it, and holding what appeared to be the robot from the shopping center, now partially disassembled. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. "I'm Serena, I know," Tyler said. "Dad said you were coming." He stepped back from the door. "He's making eggs." She stepped inside. The house was what it was: small living room, slightly cluttered with the evidence of a child's existence. A couch that had been sat on extensively, bookshelves with an uneven mix of technical manuals and picture books and paperback novels. A pair of small sneakers by the front door next to a pair of large ones. A drawing on the refrigerator that was visible from the entryway, some kind of elaborate creature in crayon that had been given a name in a 7-year-old's handwriting, Goralosaurus. Mason appeared from the kitchen doorway. He was wearing jeans and a dark Henley, and looked like he hadn't spent any time this morning thinking about the fact that she was coming, which was probably accurate. "You found it all right," he said. "GPS," she said. "You want coffee?" "Yes." "Thank you." She followed him into the kitchen and took a seat at the table because he gestured toward it, and because standing in someone else's kitchen felt unnecessarily formal. Tyler reappeared and sat across from her and began reassembling the robot with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting for an audience. "It has 3 modes," he told her. "What are the 3 modes?" "Scout mode, defense mode, and self-repair mode." He clicked something into place. "I'm trying to make self-repair mode work, but there's a piece missing." "Have you looked at the instructions?" Tyler gave her a look that was so precisely like his father's expression that it caught her slightly off guard. "Instructions are for when you've already tried everything else," he said. Mason set a mug in front of her and sat down with his own. He'd made eggs scrambled, nothing elaborate, the kind of thing a person made when they were feeding a child on a weekend morning and a guest had arrived, and the easiest solution was to make enough for 3. There was toast, butter, a jar of strawberry jam that had been opened and not closed quite properly. They ate. It was not awkward in the way she had expected. Mason was not a talker, that was clear, but he wasn't performing silence either. He asked her, between bites, whether the police had told her anything useful. She gave him the outline of what Rourke had said about the vehicle and the access question. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Your driver called in sick."
"Yes."
"Second," she said. "He had a stomach thing in October." "Both time-scheduled days." She looked at him. "The October one was a Tuesday. My standing security briefings are Tuesday mornings. Without him, I take the garage." Mason nodded slowly, the way he had in the garage, that processing quiet that was different from indecision. "Someone's been paying attention for a while," he said. "The detective thinks. That's what I think too." He paused. "Who has access to your full schedule? Not just your calendar. Actual movement patterns. My executive team. My assistant. My security firm. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. And about 200 people with various levels of access to internal systems who could piece it together if they were motivated. Narrow it down, he said. It's not 200 people. Someone in that garage had organized resources, had a plan, had backup they didn't use. Takes either money or reach or both. Probably both. That's not a disgruntled mid-level employee. She looked at him. You're analyzing this. Habit, he said, which was apparently all he was going to offer on that point. Tyler, without looking up from the robot, said, Dad used to be in the military. Tyler, Mason said. What? She probably already knows. I didn't, actually, Serena said. Mason was quiet for a moment. Then he said Navy. Long time ago, she didn't push it. She had the sense, clear as anything, that pushing it was the exact wrong approach with this particular person, and that patience would yield more than pressure. Instead, she said, the analysis is useful. I've been thinking about it, but I've been thinking about it emotionally, which means I keep running into the same walls. What walls? I don't want to believe it's someone I know, she said. Which means I keep finding reasons why it isn't. He looked at her steadily. That's going to be a problem. I know it's going to be a problem, so stop doing it. She almost laughed, which surprised her. That simple. No, he said, it's not simple at all, but it's necessary. Tyler successfully reassembled something on the robot, and it made a small electronic sound that indicated progress. He held it up and showed it to nobody in particular, satisfied. Serena left an hour later, after more coffee and a conversation about Tyler's school project on ocean ecosystems, during which Tyler corrected her twice on facts about anglerfish that she had not known she was wrong about. She said goodbye to both of them in the doorway, and Mason walked her to the porch. I'd like to come back, she said. Not to impose. But I'd like to keep talking through what I know. He leaned against the porch rail. You have a security firm. Yes, she said. And I'm not sure I trust them. He absorbed this. Why not? Because they're the security firm my executive team recommended. And if the problem is coming from my executive team, then the security firm is either compromised or being managed by someone who is. She looked at him directly. You're not connected to any of that. You don't want anything from me. And you noticed things in that garage in about 4 seconds that the police took 2 days to consider. He didn't say anything immediately. There was a fraction of a moment where she thought he was going to tell her this wasn't his problem, wasn't his world anymore. That he had a son to raise and eggs to make and a life that was organized exactly the way he needed it to be. Instead, he said, What are you currently doing about internal access logs? I have a preliminary analysis started. Nothing formal yet. Get me the structure, he said, not the content. Just the organizational chart and access tier levels. I want to see how information moves in your company. She nodded. All right. She was halfway down the porch steps when he said, Serena. She turned around. He was still leaning on the rail, looking at her with an expression that she'd only seen once before, briefly, in the garage, something that was entirely serious and entirely without performance. Be careful between now and when we talk again. Don't change your routine visibly. Don't let anyone know you're looking. Understood, she said. She drove back to the city with the heat on low and the radio off, thinking. She came back the following Tuesday, and then again the Friday after that. Each time she brought the organizational documents Mason had asked for, and each time he spread them on the kitchen table and went through them with the systematic attention of a man who had been trained to find the thing that wasn't where it was supposed to be. Tyler was usually doing homework or building something nearby, and the three of them settled into a rhythm that none of them had planned, and none of them commented on. Third visit, Tyler showed Serena the Ocean Project, a poster board, decorated with careful drawings and printed photographs, with paragraphs that he had written himself in a handwriting that was trying very hard to be neat. This part about bioluminescence, Serena said, reading it, is really well explained. Dad helped me with the words, Tyler said. But the idea was mine. I wanted to explain why things glow in the dark. Because they need light where there's none. She looked up at Mason, who was studying something in the organizational charts, and did not appear to be listening, but clearly was, because the corner of his mouth moved slightly. That's a good reason, she said to Tyler. I know, Tyler said, with the complete certainty of a 7-year-old who has not yet learned that confidence requires apology. Documents were telling a story that Serena did not want to be true. Mason had started from the access logs, specifically the pattern of access to her personal calendar and security protocols in the weeks preceding the garage incident. He had mapped it out on a piece of graph paper, which Serena found slightly charming in a context where she'd expected spreadsheets, and the map showed something unmistakable. A recurring pattern of access from a user node associated with the executive suite's administrative systems. Not direct access that would have left an obvious fingerprint. Routed access, passed through an intermediate system that would have made it appear to be routine automated sync. Someone had been careful about it. The kind of careful that required technical knowledge and access level and time. This isn't someone who panicked and made a decision, Mason said, pointing at the pattern on the graph paper. This is someone who is building toward something. Look at the timeline. First access in September, then again in October around when your driver called in sick. Then a series of accesses in November and early December as the plan got more specific. Serena sat across from him and looked at the graph paper and felt the peculiar cold that came from seeing something you had suspected confirmed in a form you couldn't argue with. Someone in my executive team, she said. Someone at that level or higher, Mason said. Access routing goes through a system that only your senior executives can touch. There are 4 people at that level, she said. My CFO, my CTO, my VP of operations, and my EVP. She paused. Graham Voss. He's the EVP. He's been with me since year 2. He helped build the company. Tell me about him. She had been avoiding telling him about Graham, she realized. For the same reason she'd been avoiding the whole direction of this analysis, because Graham Voss was one of the people she had believed in. And believing in someone and then discovering what that belief was worth was a specific kind of damage that didn't announce itself all at once. It arrived in pieces. He's 51, she said. He came from a larger competitor. He brought contacts, resources, and experience I didn't have. He helped me navigate the first series of institutional investor relationships. She stopped. Started again. He's also been managing several major contract relationships almost independently for the past 18 months. I trusted him to handle it because I was dealing with the expansion. Mason said nothing, which was its own form of attention. I started an audit, she said, 3 weeks ago. Quiet. I was concerned about some irregularities in contract valuations, not major ones, but things that didn't resolve when I looked at them directly. She looked at Mason. I told 2 people I was starting the audit, my CFO and Priya. Who does the CFO report to in a functional sense? The board, she said. But day to day, the executive suite runs together. They all know each other's business to some degree. Did Voss know about the audit? She sat back in her chair. I don't know, she said. I specifically didn't tell him. But she stopped. But people talk, Mason finished. People talk, she agreed. They sat with that for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Tyler, at the other end of the table, had fallen asleep with his head on his folded arms and his ocean project tucked beneath his elbow. His face slack and entirely peaceful in the way that children's faces went when they stopped performing wakefulness. Mason looked at his son for a moment with an expression that was different from the one he used for everything, else not softer exactly, but more honest, as though the careful management he applied to most of his face simply didn't apply in that direction. He falls asleep like that, and then insists he wasn't sleeping, Mason said quietly. I've seen adults do the same thing in board meetings, Serena said. I bet you have. She looked at him. The kitchen was quiet and warm against the cold outside, and the graph paper with its careful lines was on the table between them, and she was aware not for the first time, but more clearly than before of how strange this was. This arrangement. This man she had not known 3 weeks ago, in whose kitchen she now sat with enough frequency that she knew where the extra coffee mugs were kept, and that Tyler took his cereal with cold milk, not warm. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. Why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You did what you did in the garage, and that was more than enough. But this, she gestured at the graph paper. This is something else. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "'Cause you're not going to be safe until you understand what you're dealing with. And I can see the shape of it more clearly than you can right now, because you're too close to it." That's a reason, she said. But it's not the whole reason. He looked at her. The expression on his face was not exactly comfortable, but it was honest, which she had come to understand was the version of comfort he offered. "No," he said. "It's not the whole reason." He didn't give her the rest of it. And she didn't ask again, because she understood, in the clear and somewhat unsettling way she understood most things about him, that the rest of it was something he was still working out for himself. She drove home that night through light traffic, the city sliding past her windows, and she thought about the graph paper and the access logs and Graham Voss's careful, pleasant face in the weekly executive meeting. She thought about the 7-year-old asleep over his ocean project. She thought about the way Mason had looked at his son and the way he had looked at her when she'd asked why, and the way those were two very different looks and yet somehow came from the same place in him. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her. She glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Text message. 4 words. Stop what you're doing. She read it twice. Then she put the phone face down on the seat and drove, and her hands on the wheel were steady, and the fear underneath the steadiness was the kind of fear that confirmed you had been right about what you suspected. She called Mason from the parking garage of her building. He picked up on the second ring. "I got a message," she said. Anonymous. 4 words. Stop what you're doing. A pause. She could hear the quiet of his house behind him, the particular quality of silence that a small home had late at night when the child inside it was asleep. "Screenshot it," he said. "Don't delete it. Don't respond to the number." "I know," she said. Serena. His voice was the same as it always was, level, unhurried, but underneath it was something she had learned to hear in the weeks of Saturday mornings and Tuesday evenings. Something that was not quite warmth, but was adjacent to it in the way that a thing you haven't had in a long time is adjacent to the word for it. "This means you're close. That message doesn't get sent unless someone is worried." "I know that too," she said. "Okay." A pause. "Get inside." "Lock up. I'll call you in the morning." She went inside. She locked up. She stood in the entrance of her very expensive and very empty apartment and looked at the 4 words on her phone screen until they stopped looking like a threat and started looking like something else. Confirmation. She was right about Graham Voss. She was right about the audit. And somewhere in the structure of the company she had spent 6 years building, something had been quietly and deliberately rotting. She put the phone on the counter and went to make tea she didn't particularly want, because it was something to do with her hands, and she stood in her kitchen, which was beautiful and modern and nothing like Mason's, and thought about what came next. She was not going to stop. That much was settled. The question now was how to move without letting the person her see the direction she was going, and she was going to need help with that. And the only person whose help she trusted without qualification was a man who had walked toward danger on her behalf when she was a stranger to him, and had not once, in all the weeks since, given her a single reason to doubt him. That was, she thought, not nothing. In fact, it was the exact opposite of nothing. She drank her tea standing at the counter, thinking hard, and outside the city made its ordinary sounds, and somewhere across it, in a small gray-blue house on a quiet street, she knew, without knowing how she knew it, that Mason Kincaid was not sleeping either. Mason called at 7:15 the next morning, which was earlier than she'd expected and exactly when she'd needed it. She had slept badly, in the fragmented way that came from a mind that refused to fully disengage 2 hours solidly, then an hour of half-consciousness where the anonymous text kept reassembling itself behind her eyes, then another stretch of genuine sleep that ended when her alarm went off at 6:30 and left her feeling like she'd been dragged sideways through the night rather than rested inside it. She was on her second cup of coffee and standing at the window, watching the city's morning traffic, when her phone rang and his name appeared on the screen. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said. "You some." A pause that was not uncomfortable. "I want to look at the access logs again. The ones from September. Can you get me the raw export, not the summary? I can have Priya pull them." "Not Priya," he said. "Pull them yourself. Log in directly and export them yourself. Don't tell anyone you're doing it." She understood why immediately. "You think Priya's compromised?" "I don't know. But right now the only person whose access to this information I'm certain about is yours." Another pause. "And mine." She pulled the logs herself from her personal executive login at 8:15 that morning before anyone else arrived on her floor. She forwarded the export to a personal email account she had set up years ago and never used for company business, an old habit from the early days of the company, when she had been paranoid about data security in the way that founders were before they had IT teams to be paranoid for them. She sent Mason the link. He called back at noon. "Can you come tonight?" he said, after Tyler's in bed. "This is going to take more than a kitchen table conversation." "I can come at 8:30, she said. 8:30 is fine. She arrived to find the kitchen cleared of its usual disorder and replaced with a different kind, the organized disorder of someone who had been working. The graph paper from the previous sessions had been joined by several printed pages that Mason had clearly run off somewhere, annotated in pencil with a handwriting that was precise and slightly cramped, the kind of handwriting that had been trained toward utility rather than aesthetics. There were 3 separate stacks of paper, each held with a binder clip, and a yellow legal pad with columns that she recognized from the structure of the organizational chart she'd given him. He had a cup of coffee. He offered her one. She took it and sat down and looked at what was spread on the table. "Walk me through it," she said. He sat across from her and turned the legal pad so she could read it right side up. "I started with the access pattern," he said, "the September to December sequence. I mapped each access event against the organizational calendar, your travel schedule, scheduled board meetings, the times your security driver was assigned. What I was looking for was correlation. Whether the access events lined up with times when someone would have known you were going to be moving through a predictable, low-security environment. And every access event precedes a day when your routine changed. Not by much a day, sometimes 2. Whoever was doing this was doing prep. Running through your schedule, identifying windows. Then in October, when your driver called in sick the first time, there's a cluster of access events in the 48 hours before. Someone was watching to see how you handled it, whether you took the garage, how long you stayed, what route you walked." Serena wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and said nothing. "The October sick day was a test run," Mason said. "They were seeing whether the setup was viable, whether you were predictable enough. When you were, they waited for the right moment and used December to move. Graham Voss," she said. "The access routing puts it at that level. But I want to be careful about one thing." He looked at her. "The routing is designed to obscure. It's set up so that the access appears to come from an automated system rather than a person. That takes sophistication. Either Voss has technical capability I don't know about, or he had help from someone with systems access. His executive assistant has broad system permissions," Serena said slowly. "He advocated for that specifically, said it was about efficiency." "What's the assistant's name?" "Daniel Cho. He's been with Graham for 4 years. Came over with him from the previous company." Mason wrote the name on the legal pad. "I want to pull his access history separately and see if there's a secondary pattern underneath the routed one. If Graham was using Daniel as a technical intermediary, Daniel's access log will show the groundwork, the systems queries that had to happen before the calendar access was possible. Can you do that with what I've given you?" "Partially. I need the system administrator log from your IT department, not the user-facing log. The back-end record that shows who queried what at the infrastructure level." She thought about that. "Our IT director is a woman named Cora Shields. I've known her since year 3. She's not part of the executive suite. She reports directly to the CTO, but she's operationally independent. I think I can trust her. Think or no?" She didn't answer immediately because he deserved the honest version rather than the reassuring one. "Think," she said finally. "I've never had a reason to test it." He nodded. "Go to her in person, not email, not phone. Tell her it's a personal security matter and you need the log pulled quietly without flagging it in the system. If she asks why, tell her you're concerned about an insider threat and you're not ready to formalize it yet. What if she goes to the CTO? Then we'll know something new," he said, which was not comfortable, but was honest. She got the log from Cora Shields on a Wednesday afternoon, after a conversation in a stairwell on the 8th floor that felt slightly absurd, given that Serena was a woman who had once spoken to 8,000 people from a conference stage. Cora had listened, asked 2 precise questions, and produced the export on a thumb drive within 4 hours. She had not gone to the CTO. She had, as far as Serena could tell, told no one. Mason spent 2 days with the back-end log. What he found was worse than either of them had expected, in the specific way that things were worse when they confirmed your fears fully rather than partially. Daniel Cho had been running infrastructure queries against Serena's personal security protocols, not just the calendar, but the actual security configuration, the camera placement records, the building access systems for 11 months. Not continuously. In short, careful bursts, the kind that would have appeared to the casual observer as routine systems maintenance. But the targets of the queries were not routine. He had been mapping the blind spots in the parking structure's surveillance system. He had been noting the timing gaps in the security firm's patrol schedule. He had, on 4 separate occasions, accessed the personnel records for Serena's security team, including the health and availability records that would have told someone when the regular driver had a history of calling in sick. He built a blueprint, Mason said when Serena arrived on Friday evening, and he walked her through it. Start to finish, he built a blueprint of how to get to you with the minimum exposure. Parking garage was the answer the blueprint pointed to. The driver's sick day was the trigger they were waiting for. Serena looked at the annotated pages for a long moment. Tyler was upstairs. Asleep, she had arrived late enough to miss him by 30 minutes, which had become, without anyone planning it, something she noticed in a way that surprised her. She had begun to recognize the specific shape of his absence in the house, the same way you recognized the absence of sound when a noise you'd stopped noticing suddenly stopped. Graham built a company inside my company, she said. Came out quieter than she'd intended. More than that, Mason said. He pulled one of the clipped stacks of paper toward her. I started looking at the contract records you gave me. The ones flagged in your audit. I cross-referenced them against the access log timeline. Contracts Graham has been managing independently, they're connected to a pattern of vendor relationships that don't line up with what your company actually needs. The margin structures are wrong. The service agreements are structured to pass value laterally rather than to the company. Shell corporations, Serena said. I can't prove that from what you've given me. But the architecture of the vendor relationships is consistent with it. Someone has been systematically using your company's contract volume to move money through intermediaries. He looked at her directly. And when you started the audit, you became the most dangerous thing in Graham Voss's world. The word dangerous sat in the air between them. She had run a technology company for 6 years. She had fired people, negotiated hostile term sheets, navigated regulatory reviews, managed a board that occasionally wanted things she was not willing to give them. She was not unacquainted with difficulty or with the specific adversarial texture of high-stakes professional environments. But dangerous was something different. Dangerous meant the thing in the parking garage. Dangerous meant 4 words on a phone screen from an anonymous number. Dangerous meant the particular quality of stillness in Mason Kincaid's face when he looked at her across a kitchen table covered in annotated pages and understood something she was still catching up to. What do I do with this? She said. You don't take it to anyone inside your company yet, he said. Not even the people you trust. You're going to need something that can't be explained away, something that connects Graham directly to the garage, not just to the access logs. The logs are suggestive. They're not enough. A good attorney will argue automated sync errors and system anomalies until a jury falls asleep. So what's enough? The man from the garage, Mason said. The one in the hood. If we can connect him to Graham, it's over. That's the link that makes everything else irrefutable. The police are working on identifying him. Police are working on identifying him through official channels, which means they're following a process that takes time and requires evidence thresholds they may not be close to yet. He leaned back slightly in his chair. I still have contacts, people I knew from before. Some of them work in environments where information moves differently than it does through official channels. She looked at him. You've been out of that world for years. Some relationships don't expire, he said. She thought about what she wanted to say and then said it anyway, because she had learned in the past several weeks that the only productive approach with Mason was directness. Is this going to be a problem for you? Pulling those threads? He considered it for a moment with the serious, unhurried quality he brought to questions that deserved it. It'll cost me something, he said. Calling and things like that always does. But no, it won't be a problem I can't manage. She nodded. She picked up her coffee, found it cold, and drank some of it anyway. There's something else, Mason said. She looked at him. The anonymous message. The 4 words. He turned to a new page on the legal pad. That message didn't come from nowhere. Whoever sent it knew you were looking. They knew something had shifted. That means either the access logs themselves have been monitored for unusual activity, meaning someone at the infrastructure level knew you pulled them, or something changed in your behavior that someone in your environment noticed. She thought back over the past 2 weeks, the stairwell meeting with Cora, the changes in her own routine, slightly different arrival times, slightly different paths through the building. Small things, the kind of adjustments you made when you were managing something you didn't want noticed. I changed how I was moving through the building, she said. Not dramatically, but I started using different elevator banks. Varying my coffee schedule. Did anyone comment on it? Graham, she said. He mentioned it, casually. We were walking out of a meeting and he said something like, "You've been hard to track down lately," and laughed. I laughed. It seemed like nothing. Mason looked at her without saying anything. No, he said, it wasn't. She drove home that night with her hands tight on the wheel and Graham Voss's pleasant, collegial face sitting in the front of her mind, the laugh lines at his eyes, the easy way he commanded a room, the particular warmth he deployed when he wanted someone to feel that they were his exclusive focus. 4 years she had worked alongside him, had trusted his judgment on investor relationships and contract structures and personnel decisions, had gone to him when she needed someone to play devil's advocate on a major strategic choice, because he was good at it, and she had believed his opposition was in service of making the decision better. He had been making notes the whole time. She got home, went through her security protocols, and sat on her couch in her coat for several minutes before she remembered to take it off. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen and her stomach tightened before she'd fully registered the name, Graham Voss. Calling at 9:47 on a Friday night, which was not unusual. Graham called at odd hours when he had something on his mind, had done so for years, and she had always answered because that was the rhythm they'd established. She let it ring. Then she called back immediately, because not calling back would be the behavior of someone who was avoiding him, and avoidance was something he would notice and file. Serena, his voice was warm, easy, the voice of a man who was concerned. I'm sorry to call late. I wanted to check in. The board meeting next week, I've been thinking about the agenda structure, and I have some thoughts. Send them to me over the weekend, she said. I'll look at them Sunday.
Of course. And how are you doing?
Generally. A brief pause. You've seemed preoccupied lately. I'm not pressing, I just want you to know the door's open. She almost said, I know. She almost said it with the same automatic warmth she'd applied to that sentence for 4 years. Instead, she said, I'm fine. Working through some things. Nothing that won't resolve. Good, he said, that's good.
You know how much I paused.
Well, you know. I do, she said. She hung up and sat very still and thought about how good he was at this. How entirely convincing the warmth was, whether it had ever been real at all, or whether she had been reading a performance the whole time and mistaking technical skill for genuine care. She didn't sleep well that night either. Over the next 10 days, Mason moved carefully. He made 2 phone calls to people whose names Serena never asked for, in the early mornings before Tyler was awake, sitting in his truck in the driveway where the cold kept him sharp. He was specific in what he asked for. Any connection between the man from the garage, described in precise physical detail from Mason's own memory and cross-referenced against the partial surveillance image the police had released, and any known network of individuals who provided. Contracted services of an extralegal nature in the city or the surrounding region. The first call produced nothing immediately useful. The second call, made to a man named Decker, who had left a particular kind of government employment under circumstances that were never fully documented, produced something within 48 hours. The man from the garage had a name, Harlan Prue. He had a history that included 2 dismissed assault charges and 1 weapons possession that had been reduced through a plea arrangement. He operated through an intermediary network, not a formal organization, more of an informal referral system among people who needed certain kinds of work done and people willing to do it. He had been contacted through that network and had been paid through a series of transactions that had passed thumb three different accounts before reaching him. The accounts were offshore and would take time to formally trace. But the intermediary who had made the introduction, the person who had connected the person requesting Prue's services to Prue himself, was known to Decker. And that intermediary had a history of doing exactly one kind of work for exactly one kind of clientele, high net worth individuals with corporate exposure who needed problems solved discreetly. Can you get a direct connection? Mason asked. Connection, no, Decker said. But there's a layer underneath the intermediary, a financial layer. The account structure used to pay Prue. I've seen that architecture before. Specific way the transfers are routed. It's a fingerprint. Whoever set it up used the same structure at least twice before, and one of those previous instances left a trail that connects to a registered shell entity. Name on the shell? Holding company. Nothing on the surface. But the registered agent is a law firm that has exactly one client in common with your situation. He gave Mason the name of the law firm. Mason wrote it down and looked at it for a moment. Then he called Serena. She answered before the second ring. Tell me, she said. He told her. Not everything. The names of his contacts were not something he was going to put into a phone conversation, but the structure. The intermediary, the shell entity, the law firm. She was quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she said that law firm handled 3 of the contract negotiations I flagged in the audit. The ones with the worst margin structure. That's the connection, Mason said. That's the thread that ties the contracts to the abduction attempt. The same legal infrastructure was used for both. Graham Voss used the same network to move company money and to arrange what happened in that garage. A long pause. Mason. Her voice had changed. Something in it had come slightly loose, some element of the composure she kept fastidiously in place. This is actually enough, isn't it? With the access logs, the contract records, the shell entity connection, and a forensic accountant who can document the financial structure, yes. This is enough. I need to go to the board, she said. Not yet, he said immediately. Mason, not yet, he said again, steadier this time. If you go to the board before you've secured the evidence independently, Graham has time to move. He has contacts on that board. He's cultivated them for 4 years. 2 of those board members have voted consistently in line with his recommendations and against yours on contested decisions. If word gets to him that you're about to present this, he'll destroy the evidence, she said, or he'll move money, or both. You need to bring in a forensic accountant independently, through your personal attorney, not through company counsel. You need the financials documented and preserved before Graham knows you're coming. He paused. And you need something you haven't got yet. What? Harlan Prue, Mason said. If Prue can be connected to Graham directly, not through 3 layers of intermediary, but directly, the criminal case is sealed. Right now, what you have proves a financial crime and suggests a connection to the abduction attempt. That's not the same as proving it. How do you get Prue connected directly? I'm working on that, he said. He was, in fact, working on it. It was the piece he hadn't told Serena yet, because he didn't fully have it, and because giving someone hope based on an incomplete plan was a particular kind of cruelty he'd learned to avoid. Decker had given him one more piece of information before ending their conversation that Harlan Prue was not currently in the city, had moved after the failed abduction with the practical reflexes of a man who understood exposure, but was in contact with his intermediary through a channel that Decker's network could monitor. If Prue made contact again, whether to report on the job, to request additional payment, or simply to establish his continued availability, that contact would create a record. Decker had said he would flag it when it happened. Mason had thanked him. Decker had said, in the particular way of men who had lived in certain kinds of environments, that they were square now, and Mason should not call this particular number again, which was fair and which Mason understood completely. He had 3 days before something changed. It happened on a Thursday, not from Decker but from a direction Mason had not predicted, and like most of the events in the preceding weeks, it arrived without warning and required immediate decisions. A local news website published a story. He saw it first on his phone at 7:15 in the morning while Tyler was eating cereal, and the headline hit him with the specific unpleasant jolt of a thing you have been subconsciously preparing for without consciously admitting it. Billionaire CEO's mystery bodyguard, decorated operator, or dangerous obsessive. He read the full story while standing in his kitchen with his coffee going cold. It was thorough in the specific way that a story was thorough when someone with resources had fed information to a journalist rather than a journalist having assembled it independently. His military service record, or a carefully curated version of it, was there. His SEAL designation, his unit classification, his discharge date. A source, described as a former colleague, suggested that Mason had struggled significantly after leaving the service and after the death of his wife, that he had become isolated, that his judgment was not reliable, that he had demonstrated patterns of behavior that raised questions about his psychological stability. Another source, described as someone familiar with the Kincaid family situation, suggested that his involvement with Serena Vale was financially motivated, that he had inserted himself into her life following the parking garage incident and had been leveraging proximity to her for personal gain. There was a photograph. It was from several years ago, taken at an angle that made him look like someone who was avoiding the camera rather than simply a private person going about an ordinary day. His home address was not in the story. Tyler was not in the story. He was grateful for both of those things and tried to focus on them. He put the phone down on the counter and stood there for a moment. "Dad," Tyler said, without looking up from his cereal. "You're doing the thing where you're not blinking." "What thing?" "The thing where you look at something, but you're not actually looking at it." Mason picked up his coffee and drank from it. "Finish your cereal," he said. He called Serena. She had already seen it. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice had the tight, controlled quality of someone managing a strong response at close range. "This is Graham. This has to be Graham. He's trying to isolate you, to give the board a reason, to pressure me to cut you out of whatever they think is happening." "I know," Mason said. "Are you as Tyler's fine?" "He's eating cereal. He doesn't know." A pause. The address wasn't in it. "Small mercies," she said, which was not a phrase she typically used, and the irregularity of it told him something about where she was emotionally. "Serena." He kept his voice even. "This is actually useful to us." "How is this useful to us?" "Because Graham just showed his hand," Mason said. "He knows we're close. He knows the audit is active. He knows or suspects that I'm the one helping you connect the pieces, and he tried to neutralize that by coming after my credibility publicly." "That's a reactive move." "Reactive means scared." A pause. "He's scared," she said. "Yes, which means whatever he's been protecting, he believes we're close to finding it." "What about the board?" "They're going to call. Half of them already have. My phone's been going since 6 this morning." "Let them call," he said. "Don't answer yet. Buy yourself 48 hours. Tell Priya you're reviewing the allegations and will have a statement shortly. Don't say anything about me specifically. Don't confirm or deny the relationship. The board is going to pressure me to distance myself from you. Graham will make sure of it. He'll frame it as protecting the company's reputation." Mason stood at his kitchen window and looked at the street outside. The ordinary morning proceeding in its ordinary way, a neighbor walking a dog, a delivery truck idling at the corner. He thought about what the next 48 hours looked like. He thought about Tyler's schedule and whether the reporters would find the house and what he would do if they did. He thought about what Serena was going to face when that board call happened, and he thought about what it would cost her to hold her ground. "If you want to distance yourself from me, I understand it," he said. "Step back. I'll give you everything I've put together, and you take it to your attorney independently. It can be structured so my name doesn't appear anywhere in the chain." Silence on the other end of the line. A long one. "Mason," she said finally. "I mean it. It's a legitimate option. Protecting the company is—" "Stop talking," she said. Her voice was steady and something else. "I'm not distancing myself from you because Graham Voss fed a character assassination to a second-rate news site. That's not—" She stopped, started again. "That's not who I am." He didn't say anything. "I'm going to need you at the board meeting," she said. "Not officially, but I'm going to need you there. Can you arrange Tyler?" "I'll find someone for Tyler," he said. "Okay." A breath. "And Mason, I'm sorry this landed on you. Your name in a story like that, your history used like my—" "Don't apologize for what Graham did," he said. "Save the energy for what comes next." "All right," she said. She hung up. He looked at his phone for a moment. Then he looked at Tyler, who had finished his cereal and was looking at him with the direct, uncomplicated attention of a child who understood that something had shifted without needing to know what it was. "You okay, Dad?" Mason set his phone on the counter and straightened up. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay. Is the lady okay, Serena?" Mason said. "You know her name. Is Serena okay?" "She's going to be." He crossed to the table and picked up the cereal bowl and took it to the sink. "Go get your backpack. You're going to be late." "I'm not going to be late. I'm always ready on time." "Then be ready on time while moving faster," Mason said. Tyler grinned and disappeared up the stairs in the noisy, unself-conscious way he moved through the house. Mason stood at the sink for a moment, running the water, looking out the small window above it. The story was going to spread. That was already in motion and couldn't be stopped. By afternoon, it would be on the larger aggregators, and by evening, the television stations would have picked it up. The narrative Graham had constructed dangerous, unstable, financially motivated was simple and easy to transmit, and simple and easy always traveled faster than complicated and true. He thought about Detective Rourke, about whether to call him and get ahead of the story from the police investigation angle before Rourke saw the news coverage and started asking questions Mason didn't want to answer on someone else's timeline. He thought about Decker and whether Prue had made contact yet through the monitored channel. He thought about Graham Voss arriving at the office this morning, reading the story he had arranged, and feeling the particular satisfaction of a man who believed he had just reset the board in his favor. Mason dried his hands on the dish towel by the sink. Graham was wrong about what he had reset. He had not created distance between Mason and Serena. He had not slowed the investigation. He had not bought himself the time he thought he'd bought. All he had done was confirm that he was frightened enough to act rashly, and a frightened man acting rashly was a man making mistakes he was not aware of yet. The thing about a trap, Mason knew from long experience, was that it only worked if the person walking into it believed they were in control of the ground. Graham Voss believed he was in control of the ground. He was not. Tyler came back down the stairs with his backpack and his jacket, and the particular readiness of a child who had in fact been prepared the entire time and merely needed to be asked to demonstrate it. Mason got his own jacket and his keys and held the front door open, and they went out into the cold morning together, the ordinary domestic machinery of their life, proceeding in its ordinary way, and nothing about them from the outside would have suggested that anything was different. That was, Mason thought as he backed the truck out of the driveway, exactly the point. The 48 hours after the story broke were the longest Serena could remember since the early days of the company, when she had been 26 years old and running out of runway and making calls to investors who didn't return them, sitting in her rented office space at 11 at night, wondering whether she had made a catastrophic miscalculation about her own abilities. This was different. This was worse in some ways and more manageable in others. And the difference between the two versions of crisis then and now was that then she had been entirely alone, and now she was not. The board calls started at 6 in the morning and did not stop. She let Priya handle the initial wave, with instructions to tell each caller that she was reviewing the situations, and would have a formal response within 48 hours. By noon, 3 of the 7 board members had sent written messages through official channels requesting an emergency meeting. By 3 in the afternoon, 2 more had joined them. By evening, only 2 board members had not formally weighed in, and one of those 2 called her personal cell at 7:15 and spoke to her directly. His name was Harold Fitch. He was 71 years old and had been on the board since year 4, brought in at the recommendation of an institutional investor who had since been replaced by someone else. He had white hair and a deliberate way of speaking, and had, in 4 years, never once voted against Serena on anything that mattered. "I'm not going to tell you how to handle this," he said when she answered. "I know you well enough to know that would be a waste of both our time. But I want you to understand something clearly, and I want you to hear it from me, rather than from the version that's going to be delivered at whatever meeting gets called this week." "Tell me," she said. 3 of the board members who signed that request are in Graham's pocket, Harold said. "I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean he has cultivated those relationships specifically to build leverage against you, if it ever came to a moment like this one. I've watched him do it for 2 years, and I've been trying to figure out how to tell you without sounding like a paranoid old man." Serena sat down on the edge of her couch, Harold. "I know, I should have said it sooner. I'm saying it now, a pause. Whatever you're doing, whatever that man the article was about, is helping you finish it quickly. Because the board meeting they're going to force is going to happen whether you want it or not. And if you don't walk in with something concrete, they're going to use the press coverage to pressure you into a position you can't recover from. How long do I have? A week, he said. Maybe 10 days if you play the delay carefully. After that, the institutional investors start talking to each other. And once that conversation starts, it takes on its own momentum. She thanked him. She meant it entirely. She called Mason the moment Harold hung up. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she had learned his silences well enough by now to know the difference between the ones where he was processing and the ones where he had already processed and was deciding how much to say. Decker called me an hour ago, he said. She sat up straighter.
Prue?
Prue made contact through the monitored channel. He was requesting final payment. Apparently, the agreed amount was structured with a completion holdback, and since the job didn't complete, he's arguing there was a complication rather than a failure. He's also making a secondary request. What kind of secondary request? Another job, Mason said. Same target. The room went very quiet around her. He's trying again, she said. He's been asked to try again, Mason said. Which means Graham has decided that the cleanest solution is still the original one, and the press story was a parallel effort, not a replacement. He wants both. She pressed her hand flat against the cushion beside her and felt the solid resistance of it and used that to stay in the present moment rather than the one where she was processing what it meant that someone had decided, again and more deliberately, that she needed to not exist. What did Decker do with the contact? He has the transcript. Full record of the communication. Prue named the intermediary in the exchange by implication rather than directly, but clearly enough. And the payment discussion referenced the original transaction, which gives us the financial thread we needed. That's the direct connection, she said. Prue to the intermediary to Graham. Not quite yet. It's Prue to the intermediary. The intermediary to Graham is still one layer of shell entity. But with the law firm connection and the contract records and this, he paused. Your attorney needs to see all of this tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight, I'll call her now. And Serena, his voice was level. It always was, which she had come to rely on more than she'd admitted to herself. Until this is resolved, I need you to change where you're sleeping. Don't stay at your apartment tonight. A beat. You think he's going to move quickly. I think he published that story to create a window. To make it look like I'm the problem, get the board focused on that and use the distraction to take another run at the original plan before you can present anything to anyone. He paused. I think he's been planning the second attempt since January. She thought about her apartment. The beautiful, modern, expensive apartment she had spent an afternoon furnishing 4 years ago with the particular satisfaction of someone who had earned something and allowed themselves to enjoy it. She thought about sleeping there tonight with this information in her head. Call my attorney, she said, and I'll make arrangements. Where will you go? She thought about it honestly. Her options were limited in the particular way. They were limited for someone who had, over 6 years of building a company, allowed most of her personal relationships to become professional ones. There was a college friend in the suburbs who would welcome her without questions. There was a hotel where nobody would look for her. I'll figure it out, she said. A pause on his end. A longer one than usual. You can stay here, he said. The couch is not comfortable, but it's Mason, she said. It's the most defensible option, he said, which was so precisely him that she almost laughed. I know the perimeter. I know every entry point. And nobody in Graham's network is going to be looking at my address because they think they've already neutralized me through the press. Tyler, she said. Tyler would not be upset about it, he said. He'd probably ask you to look at his science project. He always asks me to look at his science project. He likes an audience. She packed a bag in 11 minutes, which was fast enough that she was impressed with herself, and drove to Mason's house through thin Thursday night traffic. He had the porch light on. She parked in the driveway behind the Ford and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the small house with its covered porch and its lit windows, and felt something that was difficult to name, precisely something between relief and recognition, the particular feeling of arriving somewhere that had become, without a formal announcement, a place she was allowed to be. She went in. Tyler was not asleep. He appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajamas approximately 90 seconds after the front door closed, looked down at her with the alert expression of a child who had been lying in bed cataloging sounds and had correctly identified this one as interesting. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. "Are you staying here?" "Tonight," she said, "if that's okay with you." He considered this with appropriate seriousness. "You can have the extra blanket," he said. "Cold, if you don't have the extra blanket." "That's very thoughtful," she said. He nodded, satisfied with this exchange, and disappeared back into his room. She heard his bed creak as he got back into it, and then a silence that suggested he was now lying there, processing the development with the private intensity that children brought to unexpected events. Mason had made tea, which she suspected was for her benefit rather than his own, and they sat at the kitchen table with the documents spread between them. Her attorney had been briefed by phone on the drive over and had agreed to come to the house at 9 the next morning and went through everything. One more time, methodically, constructing the presentation that Serena was going to need to make to the board. They worked for 3 hours. Mason was thorough in a way that she recognized as professional rather than personal, the organized, hierarchical sequencing of evidence that made a case legible to people who were not living inside it. He understood how to build toward a conclusion rather than stating it and then defending it. He understood that the board would resist the narrative emotionally before they accepted it logically, and he structured the presentation to lead with the financial evidence, which was hardest to argue with, before moving to the access logs, and then to the Prue connection, so that by the time the board arrived at the abduction, they had already accepted the financial crime, and the abduction simply completed the picture. "You've done something like this before," she said, around midnight, when they had gotten through the second pass of the structure. "Briefings," he said. "Different context. Same architecture. You're presenting a case to people who don't want to believe it. The order matters. What was the context?" He looked at her. It was late, and the kitchen had the particular intimacy of late-night hours in small rooms, and he looked tired in a way she had not seen before, not defeated, but carrying something he had been carrying for a long time, and not always successfully. "Intelligence briefings," he said, presenting threat assessments to commanders who had operational reasons to prefer a different conclusion. A pause. "You learn to make the evidence do the arguing for you, because the moment you appear to be arguing, they stop listening to the evidence." "Did it work?" "Sometimes," he said. "Not always." He picked up his coffee and found it empty and set it back down. "The times it didn't," he stopped. She waited. "People got hurt," he said, "because someone in a room preferred a conclusion that the evidence didn't support." She looked at him across the table, at the tired, careful, contained face of a man who had been carrying that specific weight for long enough that it had become structural part of how he held himself, part of why he was so precise about evidence and so uninterested in conclusions that outran it. "Why you left," she said. "Not a question. That's one of the reasons," he said. She didn't push it. The hour was late, and they had work that needed finishing, and she had learned with Mason that the things he offered voluntarily were worth more than anything extracted, and she didn't want to be the kind of person who extracted. They finished the structure at 12:40. She gathered the documents into the order they'd decided on. Mason moved the stacks to the counter, out of the way, and she looked at the cleared table and thought about how many things had been spread across it over the preceding weeks, graph paper and printed logs and legal pads, and how all of it had been leading to the board meeting that was now less than a week away. "Some sleep," he said. "You too," she said. He brought the extra blanket down from upstairs, the one Tyler had promised her, and left it on the couch with a pillow. He said good night in the simple, unadorned way he said most things, and went upstairs, and she lay on the couch in the dark with the blanket pulled up and listened to the house settle into its nighttime sounds and felt, for the first time in weeks, something close to safe. Her attorney, Sandra Okafor, arrived at 9 sharp the next morning and spent 4 hours with the documents. Sandra was 53 and had been practicing corporate and criminal law for 25 years and had the focused and sentimental manner of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what people did to each other for money. She asked precise questions. She made notes. She occasionally looked up from the documents with an expression that she probably didn't realize was visible, the expression of someone whose internal assessment was more serious than their professional composure was designed to show. At 1:15, she put down her pen and looked at Serena. "This is significant," she said. "I know it's significant," Serena said. "I mean structurally significant. The financial evidence alone supports a serious criminal referral. The access logs corroborate motive and premeditation. Prue connection, once it's formally documented through official channels, closes the loop on the abduction attempt." She paused. This man, she glanced at Mason, who was sitting at the far end of the table with his arms crossed, and his expression tutorial did exceptional work. "He's thorough," Serena said. Sandra looked at Mason directly. "I'm going to need you to provide a formal statement about the information from your source. Not naming the source, but documenting the nature of the information and how it was obtained. Can you do that?" "Yes," Mason said. "And the source the information was obtained legally? Nothing that creates exposure on your end?" "The information was obtained through a monitored communication channel," Mason said. "The monitoring was conducted by a private individual with legitimate access to that channel. Nothing was intercepted. Nothing was obtained through illegal surveillance." He paused. "My attorney can review the specifics if you want a formal opinion." Sandra nodded slowly. "Get me that opinion by Monday." She turned back to Serena. "I'm going to contact the district attorney's office this afternoon. Not to file anything yet, to brief a contact I have there and ensure that when we do move formally, there's a process ready to receive it. You do not want this going to the police through a general intake process. You want it going directly to someone who understands corporate crime and can act quickly." "How quickly?" Serena asked. "If I brief my contact today and we have the formal statement from another glance at Mason your source by Monday, I can have a referral structured for Wednesday. The board meeting can happen Thursday." She looked at Serena. "You're going to need to hold the board off until Thursday." "I can do that," Serena said. "I've already started managing the delay. There's one more thing." Sandra's voice shifted slightly, not softer but more deliberate. "Graham Voss is going to know something is coming before Thursday. Maybe not the specific shape of it, but people like him, in situations like this, develop a sensitivity to the air in a room. The moment you start managing the board delay, the moment any of your staff notices a change in your behavior pattern, there's a risk he picks up on it and moves his assets." She paused. "You need to behave, between now and Thursday, as though nothing has changed. As though you're managing a PR problem caused by an overzealous ex-military man who inserted himself into your life after a traumatic event and whose involvement you're now thoughtfully reviewing." Serena looked at Mason. He met her eyes with the steady, unconcerned expression of a man who had been described in worse terms and had survived it. "I can do that," she said. "There will be a period, probably Wednesday into Thursday morning, where Graham believes he's won," Sandra said. "He'll believe the board is going to force your hand, that you're going to be pressured into a position that weakens your control of the company, and that the threat has been neutralized. You need him to believe that right up until the moment he walks into the board meeting." "And then?" Serena asked. Sandra looked at her with the expression of someone who had spent 25 years building toward moments exactly like this one. "And then you show him what you've built." The next 6 days were the strangest of Serena's professional life, and her professional life had contained some genuinely strange stretches. She went to the office every morning. She attended scheduled meetings. She had a conversation with Graham on Monday, in which he expressed with evident sincerity and considerable skill his concern about the press coverage and his support for whatever decision she felt was right regarding Mason's involvement. He was warm. He was collegial. He was the version of himself he had been performing for 4 years. And she sat across from him in the conference room and matched his warmth and his concern and his thoughtful ambiguity with equal precision and equal performance. And when the meeting ended and she walked back to her office, she sat at her desk for 3 full minutes before her hands stopped shaking. Mason called each evening. Not long calls, 5 minutes, 10 at most. Status updates, delivered in the flat, efficient register he used when he was being careful. The DA's office had received Sandra's briefing and confirmed a contact. Harlan Prue's transcript had been formally documented and submitted through Sandra's office. The forensic accountant Sandra had engaged had completed a preliminary review of the contract records and had confirmed the shell entity structure in language that was legally airtight. On Tuesday evening, Mason said, "Decker also gave me something else. Something I've been sitting on because I wanted to be sure of it before I told you." She was in her car in the building parking garage, the Vale Technologies garage, not the other one, though she had been taking different routes through it every day and had not been in it alone since December, and the parallel was not lost on her. "Tell me," she said, the second approach to Prue the new job request. Decker got the full communication. The payment instructions for the new job came through an account that Sandra's forensic accountant has now tied directly to a holding entity that has Graham Voss listed as the beneficial owner. Not a shell, not an intermediary. His name's silent. His name, she repeated. His name, Mason confirmed. He got careless. Or he got confident. Either way, there's a document with his name on it authorizing payment for a contract that describes what Harlan Prue does for money. A pause. Sandra has it. The DA has it. It's done, Serena. The case is done. Thursday is about making the board understand what's already in motion, not about convincing them. She sat in the parking garage with her phone against her ear and the engine running and thought about what done meant. She had been living inside the not done version for so long that done was slightly difficult to process. "How are you?" he asked. It was the first time he had asked that in any of the evening calls, and the specificity of the moment caught her slightly unprepared. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me Friday." "I'll ask you Friday," he said. Thursday arrived with the gray, indeterminate weather that late winter produced, not quite cold enough for proper winter, not warm enough to believe in anything else. Serena was at the office by 7. She wore the dark blazer she wore when she needed to feel like herself, the one she'd bought the week after her first significant institutional investment closed, which was the week she had allowed herself to believe the company was going to survive. She had her documents in order. Sandra had confirmed at 8:15 that law enforcement was positioned and that the timing was coordinated with the board meeting. Mason arrived at the Vale Technologies building at 8:50. He came through the main entrance, signed in at security, and rode the elevator to the 14th floor. He was wearing a dark jacket and looked like what he was, a man who did not particularly belong in a corporate environment and was not trying to pretend otherwise. Priya at her desk outside Serena's office looked up and said, without missing a beat, "She's inside." "Go ahead." Serena was standing at the window when he came in. She turned around. "You ready?" he said. "I've been ready for 2 months," she said. "I just didn't know it yet." The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the main conference room on the 14th floor. It was the largest conference room in the building, used for investor presentations and major client pitches, with 10 long glass tables and a presentation screen along one wall and a view of the city that Serena had always found steadying. At 9:50, Graham Voss arrived. He walked through the door with the easy proprietorial confidence of a man who had been in that room hundreds of times and expected to be in it hundreds more. He was dressed well, he was always dressed well, and he carried a leather portfolio that Serena recognized as the one he used for board meetings he considered important. He saw Mason and stopped. A fraction of a second, less than most people would have caught. Then the pleasantness reassembled itself, and he crossed the room with his hand out. "Mason," he said, "I have to say I'm surprised to see you here." Mason shook his hand briefly. "I imagine you are," he said. The other board members arrived in the following minutes, Harold Fitch last, with a brief look at Serena that communicated something specific and settled. The 3 board members Harold had identified as aligned with Graham took their seats and arranged their papers with the organized manner of people who believed they understood what was about to happen. Graham sat directly across from Serena, which was his usual position, and which he had always used to his advantage, the physical centering of his presence in her line of sight, the posture that said, "I belong here as much as you do." He opened his portfolio. He uncapped his pen. "Before we begin," he said, addressing the room with the tone of a man who had prepared an opening, "I want to say that I think we all understand this is a difficult moment for the company, and I believe we owe it to our shareholders and our employees to handle it with the directness and clarity that—" "Graham," Serena said. He looked at her. "I'll take it from here," she said. She nodded to the room's AV system. "And, Priya, Positioned at the back of the room, activated the presentation screen. The first document appeared. It was the contract record. The earliest one, the first shell entity relationship that the forensic accountant had identified, dated 18 months earlier. Clean, clear, annotated with the specific line items that showed value moving laterally rather than to the company. Then the second contract, then the third. Each one with the forensic accountant's notation, explaining the structure and language that required no specialist knowledge to understand. Graham's pen had stopped moving. The second section of the presentation was the access logs, the September to December sequence, mapped against Serena's schedule, the driver's sick days marked, the camera blind spot queries highlighted in a different color. Mason had helped structure this section specifically so that the pattern was visible in 30 seconds of looking. These records were obtained how, said one of the board members, Calloway, one of the three Harold had flagged. Through my executive login, Serena said, and through a legitimate back-end pull authorized by my IT director. All documented. And the analysis was conducted by a former intelligence professional whose methods and documentation are fully available to your review. She let that sit for exactly the right beat. Continue watching. The third section was the shell entity, the holding company, and then the document, the payment authorization, the one with Graham Voss listed as beneficial owner, the one that connected his name to the account that had paid for Harlan Prue's second approach. The room was very quiet. Graham's face had not changed in any dramatic way. He was too controlled for drama. But something behind his eyes had shifted. A recalculation was happening, and she could see it, and she suspected he knew she could see it. This document, he said, his voice entirely even, is fabricated. It isn't, Sandra Okafor said, from the seat she had taken at the far end of the table. Graham looked at her. He had not registered her presence when he came in, which told Serena something about his state of mind. I'm Serena Vale's legal counsel, Sandra said. The document has been authenticated by 3 independent forensic accountants and has been in the possession of the district attorney's office since yesterday morning, along with the transcript of a communication between the individual you hired and his intermediary, which names the payment source and references the holding entity. I'd like to speak with my attorney, Graham said. You're welcome to, Sandra said. However, I should tell you that there are 2 law enforcement officers currently in the building waiting to speak with you directly. That conversation is going to happen today, regardless of what occurs in this room. The 3 board members who had signed Graham's request were looking at the presentation screen, with expressions ranging from blank to the specific pallor of people who were recalculating how much they had invested in a position that had just become extremely expensive. Harold Fitch, at the far end of the table, was looking at Serena with the steady, quiet expression of a man who had been waiting for this for a long time and was allowing himself a private moment of relief. Graham put his pen down on the table. He set his hands flat on either side of it. He looked at Serena, really looked at her, for the first time in the meeting, without the layer of performance between them, and for a moment she saw something in his face that was almost recognizable as the person she had thought she knew. Almost. You found all of this, he said. It came out less like an accusation than like a genuine statement of fact, mildly inflected with something she might have called respect if the context hadn't made that absurd. I had help, she said. His eyes went briefly to Mason, who had been sitting at the side of the room and had not spoken and had not moved and had been, for the entire duration of the presentation, exactly what he needed to be, present. Graham looked back at Serena. I built half of what you have, he said. You did, she said. And then you decided what you'd built wasn't sufficient and started taking what wasn't yours. She paused. I would have given you more, if you'd asked. Whatever it was you thought you needed, we could have built it together. She stopped. But you didn't ask. The room was quiet. Then Sandra stood, which was the signal they had agreed on, and the door at the back of the room opened, and the 2 officers came in, and everything after that proceeded with the institutional efficiency of a process that had been set in motion days earlier, and simply needed this moment to complete itself. It took another 40 minutes for the room to empty, for Graham to be removed with considerably less drama than she had expected, for the 3 aligned board members to retreat into the particular silence of people, processing how thoroughly they had miscalculated, for Sandra to confirm the formal referral and the timeline for charges. When it was finally over, when the last person had gone and the room was empty except for herself and Mason and Harold Fitch, who was still in his chair looking at the presentation screen as though reviewing it, Serena sat down for the first time since 10 o'clock and found that her legs were slightly unreliable. Harold stood. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at her with the measured, genuine warmth of a man who had earned the right to it. "Well done," he said simply. She nodded. She didn't trust her voice entirely. He looked at Mason. "You too," he said, and left. The room was empty. The city sat in its usual position outside the glass wall, proceeding indifferently. The presentation screen had gone dark. Mason was still in his chair at the side of the room. She looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the expression on his face was the honest one, not the managed version, not the professional version, but the one she had seen occasionally in his kitchen at late hours when he forgot to keep it behind the other one. "You okay?" he asked. "You said you'd ask me Friday," she said. "It's close enough." She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about everything that mattered. Her hands were still slightly unsteady. There was a specific kind of exhaustion settling into her bones that she recognized as the aftermath of sustained high-functioning stress, the body presenting its bill once the immediate demand had passed. She was going to need to sleep for approximately 12 hours and eat something real and sit somewhere quiet for a while. "I think so," she said. "I think I'm okay," he nodded. "Mason." She looked at him directly, because he responded to directness better than anything else, and because she meant what she was about to say and wanted it to land clearly. "I know what this cost you, the story. Your name in print. Contacts you called in." She paused. "I know that none of that is nothing." "It's handled," he said. "I know it's handled. I'm not saying it isn't." She held his gaze. "I'm saying I know what it cost, and I'm not going to pretend I don't." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city continued its ordinary business. Somewhere in the building below them, a process was underway that was going to change. The structure of her company and the life of a man she had trusted and the various financial arrangements he had built on her back, and all of that was in motion now and would continue regardless of what was said in this room. "Tyler's at my neighbor's until 6, Mason said. She almost laughed. She did, actually a short, slightly ragged sound that was less about anything being funny and more about the relief of the tension releasing, the way a held breath finally came out. "There's a diner 2 blocks from here," she said. "The kind with the bad coffee and the good pie." "I know the one," he said. "I want to sit somewhere that isn't this building," she said. "I want bad coffee and whatever pie they have, and I want to not think about access logs for approximately 2 hours." "That's a reasonable request," he said. "I'm aware," she said. She gathered her jacket from the back of her chair and her phone from the table, and they left the conference room and walked down the hall to the elevator. And she pressed the lobby button, and they rode down in the particular quiet that existed between two people who had been through something together and were both, in their separate ways, still coming down from it. When the elevator opened and they walked out into the lobby, she noticed the reception staff watch them cross toward the exit with the open curiosity of people, with the open curiosity since seen the events of the morning from a distance and had drawn their own conclusions. She didn't acknowledge the looks, but she didn't adjust her pace either. Outside, the air was cold and real and completely indifferent to what had happened on the 14th floor, which was exactly what she needed. They walked 2 blocks in the easy, unforced silence that had become, over months and Saturday mornings and late evenings at a kitchen table, the natural register of their company. The diner appeared with its faded sign and its steamed windows. Mason held the door. She went in. The coffee was, as advertised, not good. Pie cherry, which was what they had, was exactly what she'd needed. She ate most of it and let the noise of the diner sit around her like ordinary life reasserting itself. And across the table, Mason drank his mediocre coffee and did not try to fill the silence with anything it didn't need. And outside the city moved through its afternoon in the complete indifference to human drama that cities always managed, which she had always found privately comforting. After a while she said, "What happens now? For you?" He turned his coffee cup on the table. "Same as before," he said. "Tyler, school pickups, the usual." "That's not what I meant," she said. He looked at her. He knew it wasn't what she meant. "I know," he said. She waited. "I've been figuring out what I'm supposed to do," he said. with the next part. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the sentence, which she recognized as him being honest about something he would have preferred to leave less visible. For a long time, the answer was Tyler. Tyler and keeping things steady and not adding anything to it that would make it unsteady. And now, she said. He looked at her with the honest expression, the kitchen at midnight one. Now I'm less certain that steady is the same as right, he said. It was not by any external measure a declaration. It was not the kind of thing that appeared in the kind of story people told afterward about how two people found their way to each other. It was halting and slightly uncomfortable and imprecise in the way that honest things were when a person said them before they were fully ready to say them. She understood it perfectly. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Simply, without performance, he nodded once. He picked up his coffee. He drank from it and made a brief expression at the quality of it, which she had seen him make before in his own kitchen when he ran the pot too long. Pie's better, she offered. The pie's actually good, he agreed. She pulled the plate toward the middle of the table, and he accepted a fork, and they sat in the Bad Coffee Diner 2 blocks from the building where Graham Voss's carefully constructed world had come apart that morning, and they ate cherry pie in the uncomplicated manner of two people who had been through a very long several months and had arrived, more or less intact, somewhere that felt like the beginning of something neither of them had expected, and both of them had, in their separate and guarded ways, already started to want. The cherry pie was gone before either of them fully registered eating it, which was the specific quality of a meal shared between two people who were somewhere else in their heads even while they were present at the table. Serena paid the check before Mason could reach for his wallet, which he allowed with the particular expression of a man who had opinions about it, but had decided this was not the moment. She left a tip that was more than the meal had cost, which she always did in places like this, and which she had never once thought about performing for an audience. It was simply what she did. They walked back out into the afternoon. Cold had settled more firmly while they were inside. The sky lowered to a flat gray that pressed down on the city in the way it did in the weeks between winter and whatever came next. Neither of them had anywhere they needed to be immediately. Tyler wasn't until 6. Sandra had the afternoon well in hand. The district attorney's office was running its process without needing anything further from Serena until the following week. For the first time in months, the immediate demand had stopped. They walked a block without destination, which was unusual for both of them, being people who moved with purpose as a general condition. Then Serena said, "Can we just walk for a while?" "Yeah," Mason said. "We can do that." So they walked. Through the downtown blocks, past the office buildings and the coffee shops and the dry cleaners and all the ordinary architecture of a city going about its ordinary business. And the ordinariness of it was something she needed more than she'd known the reminder that the world had been proceeding at its usual pace throughout the weeks of access logs and anonymous texts and board meetings and a man in a hood in a parking garage, that most of what existed in the city was entirely indifferent to any of it and had simply continued. She's been so inside the crisis that she'd lost the peripheral vision for everything that wasn't it. They walked for almost an hour before Mason said, "You know what I kept thinking about after the board meeting?" "What?" "Tyler's dinosaur drawing," he said. "The one on the refrigerator." She looked at him. The Gorillasaurus. "He drew a new one last week," Mason said. "A whole family of them. He spent 4 hours on it on a Saturday afternoon. He gestured with one hand in the way he sometimes did when words were imprecise, and he wanted to indicate something larger than the words. 4 hours, completely absorbed. The world could have ended outside that window, and he wouldn't have known. She understood what he was offering with that. Not an anecdote. Something about proportion, about the existence of things that continued and mattered and asked nothing of the particular crisis you happened to be managing. He named the mother one, she said. "He told me about it Tuesday." He named her Margaret, because he likes the word, Mason said. "He told me Margaret sounds like someone who knows what she's doing." She laughed at that genuinely from somewhere uncomplicated. "He's not wrong," she said. They turned back toward the Vale Technologies building, eventually, when the cold had worked its way through both their jackets, and she retrieved her car from the garage, the building's own garage, where she had reclaimed a kind of neutral relationship with parking structures in the months since December, which felt like a small but genuine victory. She drove home in the particular quiet of an evening that had nothing more it needed from her. She made dinner, actual dinner, not the assembled approximation of a meal she'd been subsisting on through the worst of the preceding weeks. Cooked something with actual heat, applied to actual ingredients, and she ate it at her table and looked out her window at the city and felt something that took her a few minutes to correctly identify. It was the particular quality of stillness that came after tension had been held so long it had been mistaken for normal. The muscles loosening, the background vigilance finally standing down. She sat with it and let it be. She called her mother that evening, which she had been meaning to do for 3 weeks, and had not done because there was always something more urgent. Her mother was 64 and lived 2 states away, and had a way of talking that was simultaneously exhausting and necessary. The way certain people were when they had known you before you became what you had become, and insisted on relating to the earlier version, which was sometimes irritating and sometimes the most grounding thing available. "You sound different," her mother said, approximately 8 minutes into the call. "Different how?" "Less like you're going to vibrate through the phone." A pause. "Something happened." "Several things happened," Serena said. "I'll tell you properly when I see you." "Is this about that man? The one in the news?" Serena closed her eyes briefly. "Mom, what?" "I saw the article. I thought he looked like someone with a story." "He does have a story," Serena said. "That's accurate. And you like him." "I do like him." "Good," her mother said, with the finality of a woman who had been waiting for this particular phone call for approximately 4 years, and was not going to make a production of it. "Bring him when you visit. And the boy. I want to meet the boy." She fell asleep before 11 for the first time in weeks, and slept without interruption until her alarm. And when she woke up, the city was already bright outside her window, with a thin, tentative quality of late winter light that was not quite spring, but was pointing in that direction. Graham Voss was formally charged 6 days after the board meeting. Sandra called her at 8:15 with the specific securities fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and 2 additional charges related to the financial structure of the shell entities that the DA's office had been working to document since receiving the initial referral. The charges were announced publicly by mid-morning, which meant the press cycle that had been running a version of the stories since December shifted to the definitive version, and the article about Mason's alleged instability and financial motivation was replaced in the general feed by articles about a corporate executive who had tried to have his CEO removed and had instead assembled, over the course of several months, a comprehensive case against himself. The correction landed in a way that Serena had not entirely anticipated, which was that it was not satisfying in the way she had expected satisfaction to feel. She had expected something like relief or vindication, and what she actually felt was closer to tired, the tiredness of someone who had spent months being right about something, and had been waiting for the world to catch up, and now that it had, catching up was simply the ending of something rather than the beginning of triumph. She issued a public statement that was direct and brief. It acknowledged the charges, confirmed that the evidence had been developed through an internal investigation she had authorized, thanked the law enforcement officials who had moved quickly and carefully. Did not mention Mason by name, which was what he had requested. Mason had been sitting in his truck outside Tyler's school when she called to read him the draft. "It's good," he said when she finished. "I want to mention you." "I know you do," he said. "Don't. You did the work. You built the case," he said. "You presented it. You held the line for 2 months under pressure that would have bent most people." What the statement should say, because that's what's true. She was quiet for a moment. "You don't like being visible." "I don't need to be visible," he said, which was a different answer and more precise. "Visible isn't the same as valuable." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She published the statement as he'd asked. It said what was true without his name in it, and she accepted that this was one of the forms that respecting someone took, letting them define the shape of their own contribution, rather than imposing the one you thought they deserved. The weeks that followed were not simple. The company required stabilizing. The board required restructuring. The 3 members most aligned with Graham resigned, which Sandra advised accepting without resistance, and new appointments were made through a process that Harold Fitch helped oversee with the steady, methodical competence of a man who had been waiting for the chance to do it properly. Daniel Cho was removed and referred to the DA's office on related charges. Corporate security firm was replaced with a different one, vetted directly by Serena and quietly by Mason, whose list of questions for the new firm's director had been more thorough than the interview process she'd originally planned. Through all of it, she and Mason continued in the pattern they had established Tuesday evenings. Saturday mornings, the occasional weeknight call when something required talking through. But the texture of it had changed since the diner. It had become less urgent and more chosen, which was the particular quality of something transitioning from necessary to wanted, and the transition was not uncomfortable, but it was something to sit with, honestly. He was careful about it. She understood why and respected it, though there were moments when the carefulness was something she wanted to move through faster than he was ready to. He had built his life very specifically around Tyler's steadiness, every decision, since Klassen 3 years earlier had been made with that as the primary consideration, not carelessly or as an excuse, but because he understood, in the clear-eyed way of a man who had seen what unsteadiness did to children, that the most important thing he could give his son was a world that was predictable and reliable and safe. Adding someone to that world required the same deliberateness he applied to everything else. She had lost patience with it once. About 6 weeks after the board meeting, on a Saturday morning, when Tyler was at a friend's house, and they were in the kitchen, and the conversation had been circling something, neither of them was naming directly, she'd said, with the frankness she applied to things that mattered, Mason, "I'm not a risk assessment." He had looked at her. "I understand why you're careful," she said. "I understand what it cost you before, and I understand what Tyler means, and I am not asking you to be reckless with any of it. But I'm also not a board meeting. You don't have to build the entire case before you're willing to act." He was quiet for a moment with the particular quality that she had learned was not resistance, but processing. "I know that," he said finally. "Do you?" "I know it," he said. He stopped. Started again. "It's been 3 years since I let anything matter that much. And the last time something mattered that much, it went away. And He stopped again, which was unusual for him, the second stop. Pressed his mouth together briefly. "I've been making sure Tyler was okay. And telling myself that was enough." "Was it?" she said. He looked at her directly, the honest look, kitchen at midnight. "No," he said. Not entirely. She had let that be what it was. She had not pushed further, because he had given her something real, and pushing past real was the thing she had resolved not to do with this particular person. He called her that evening. She answered and he said, without preamble, "I want to do this properly. Whatever this is. I want to do it deliberately, and I want to do it right, and I need a little more time to get there. But I'm not standing at the door trying to decide whether to come in. I'm already in. I just need to stop acting like I'm deciding." She sat on her couch in the comfortable silence that followed and said, "Okay, he said. "Mason, yeah. Tyler already likes me," she said. "You know that, right? You're the only one who's still making this complicated." A pause. Then, and she heard it clearly, even through a phone, the sound of him almost not laughing and then laughing anyway. The kind of laugh that a person who didn't laugh often produced when something genuinely caught them. He said, "He told me that last week, actually." What did he say? He said, and I'm quoting directly, that I should probably figure out what I'm doing, because Serena's smart and she's not going to wait forever. He said that? He's been watching too much of his grandmother's television, Mason said. But he's not wrong. She laughed. No, he's not wrong. Spring arrived with the usual argument, 2 warm weeks followed by a cold snap, followed by a May morning that finally made the case for itself. The trees along the street in front of Mason's house had gone from bare to that tentative pale green that was only available for about 10 days before it deepened into full summer. And on the Saturday morning that it happened, Tyler ran outside before breakfast and stood on the front lawn and looked at it like he'd been waiting for it specifically. Mason watched him from the porch with his coffee, and Serena came out and stood beside him and watched him watch his son, and neither of them needed to say anything about it. Tyler had adjusted to her presence in the way that children adjusted to things that were good for them, without ceremony, without declaration, by simply incorporating it into what was normal and proceeding. He showed her things. His science projects, the new Gorillosaurus family, a book about deep-sea creatures he'd gotten from the school library, that he wanted to read sections of aloud to an audience. He asked her opinions with the particular directness of a child who had decided someone's opinion was worth soliciting. He had, one Saturday in April, called her from Mason's phone because Mason was outside, and Tyler needed to know whether anglerfish were technically considered ugly or just unusual looking. And she had given the question the serious consideration it deserved, and he had said, "I thought so," and hung up, satisfied. He had not called her anything other than Serena, which was correct. She had not tried to be anything other than what she was, a person who was in his father's life, and in his life by extension, who liked him specifically rather than as a category, who did not try to replace what was absent, and did not pretend the absence wasn't there. Claire's photograph was on the bookshelf. It had been there since Serena's first visit, and she had noticed it then, and had not said anything and would not say anything, because the right approach to that presence was to let it be present, to understand that a person loving someone who was gone was not a wall between Mason and the living, but simply a dimension of who he was, and pretending otherwise would have been both dishonest and an insult to the depth of him. He talked about Claire once, in May, on a Sunday evening when Tyler was upstairs, and they were in the kitchen with the window open, to the first real warmth of the year. He talked about her the way people talked about someone they had loved well, and lost specifically, not with the performed grief of public mourning, but with the private particular detail that indicated real knowledge of a real person. He told her that Claire had been a terrible cook who refused to acknowledge it, that she had a laugh that Tyler had inherited almost exactly, which was why Tyler's laugh still occasionally caught him off guard. She had been the one to want to buy the house on this street specifically, because she liked the way it sat in relation to the other houses, slightly set back, with enough porch to be outside without being public. She would have been good at the kind of thing you do, he said. Building something from a rented desk, she had that in her. Serena absorbed this carefully. "Do you think she would have liked me?" she said, which was the honest question rather than the safe one. He thought about it with appropriate seriousness. "I think she would have liked that you didn't wait for someone to rescue you," he said. "I think she would have respected the way you ran toward the problem." He paused. "I think she would have been quietly and somewhat competitively interested in you." Serena considered this. "I'll take that," she said. "You should," he said. The summer moved. Tyler's school year ended with a ceremony in the gymnasium where he received an award for his ocean ecosystems project that he accepted with the combination of genuine pleasure and attempted indifference that 8-year-olds managed, and Mason sat in a folding chair in the second row and watched him with the expression he saved for his son, the one without management in it. And Serena sat side beside him and watched them both, and thought about how strange it was that the parking garage in December had deposited her here in a school gymnasium in June, next to a man she had not known 6 months ago, watching a child receive a certificate about anglerfish. She had spent 6 years building a company, and she understood the narrative of her own life quite well, the ambition, the work, the deliberate choices that had accumulated into a particular kind of success. She had not included in that narrative a parking garage or graph paper on a kitchen table or a 7-year-old with opinions about the naming conventions of dinosaurs. She had not planned for any of it. The thing she had come to understand, and this was the part that felt genuinely new, genuinely arrived at rather than previously known, was that the life she had planned had been good and was still good, and the life that had arrived uninvited alongside it was also good, and the two were not in competition. She had not needed rescuing in the way that the narrative of the parking garage might have suggested from the outside. She had needed someone to run toward the problem rather than away from it, and she had needed to recognize, when that person appeared, that his value to her was not separable from his value to himself. Mason did not belong to her. He belonged to himself and to Tyler, and to the specific weight of his own history, and what he chose to give was given rather than owed, which was precisely why it mattered. She understood this about herself too, that she had spent years being very good at using people productively, which was not the same as receiving what they offered freely, and that the distinction was one she was still learning. In September, Vale Technologies launched a new product line that expanded the company's reach into markets that Serena had been building toward for 2 years. The launch was clean, not perfect. Nothing was ever entirely perfect. There was a software issue in week 2 that required a rapid response from the engineering team and a press statement she wrote herself at 11 at night, but substantively clean, kind of launch that demonstrated organizational health rather than masked organizational problems. Coverage was strong. The board, newly composed and no longer managing a divided loyalty, was genuinely supportive. Harold Fitch called her the morning after the launch and said, simply, "That's the company I signed on to serve," and she accepted the compliment without deflecting it, which she had been working on. Graham Voss pleaded guilty in October to the securities fraud and wire fraud charges, with the conspiracy charge resolved through a negotiated arrangement that Sandra considered a reasonable outcome given the strength of the evidence and the efficiency of resolving it without trial. He received a sentence that would take years from the middle of his life, which Serena could not find satisfaction in and did not try to. She had spent enough time thinking about Graham to know that there was no productive version of what she felt about his choices. It was simply a waste. A person who had decided that what he could take was more important than what he could build, and had been wrong, and had paid for it, and that was the shape of the story. Harlan Prue, separately charged and separately prosecuted, took his own arrangement, and his testimony confirmed the financial connection that Sandra's forensic accountant had documented. It was, by the end, a complete case in the way that complete cases rarely were, and Serena signed the last document related to it on a Thursday afternoon and handed it back to Sandra and said, "That's it?" "That's it," Sandra confirmed. She drove to Mason's house directly from Sandra's office, because it was a Thursday, and Tyler had soccer on Thursdays, and she had started going to watch, not every week but most weeks, standing on the sideline in whatever the weather was doing, and watching a group of 8-year-olds engage in an approximation of organized soccer that was more honestly described as enthusiastic chaos. Tyler was in the middle of it, as he usually was, with the complete physical commitment of a child who understood that being in the middle of things was the correct place to be. He waved at her when he saw her arrive without breaking stride, which she had come to understand as high-volume acknowledgement from someone whose attention was fully elsewhere. Mason was at the sideline with a coffee from the portable cart that one of the other parents ran and sold from a folding table because the park had no concession stand. He handed her one when she reached him, which meant he had seen her car and bought 2 in advance, which was the kind of gesture that was not romantic in any declared sense, and was therefore exactly romantic. "Graham's case closed today," she said. He nodded. He had known it was coming. "How do you feel?" "Finished," she said. "In the good way." "Good way is good," he said. She drank her coffee and watched Tyler pursue a ball with the full inventory of his 8-year-old self and thought about finished. About the cases that closed and the ones that didn't. About the things that resolved and the ones you simply learned to carry. About how completion was rarely the arrival of something new, and more often the settling of something that had been in motion, the satisfaction of a process completing itself rather than a door swinging open. Though sometimes it was both. That evening, after soccer and after Tyler's shower and after dinner, which Serena had made because she had been learning to cook with the same methodical persistence she applied to most sins and had reached a point where she could produce a meal without a disaster as a byproduct, Tyler sat at the kitchen table with the remains of a second helping and looked at both of them with the alert, slightly calculating expression he got when something was on his mind. "Can I say something?" he said. "You're always allowed to say something," Mason said. "I know, it's kind of a big thing." "Big things are allowed too," Serena said. Tyler nodded seriously. "I was thinking," he said, "that would be okay with me. If you guys if this was more—" He stopped, made a slight face at himself, the face of someone who had prepared a speech and discovered mid-delivery that the words weren't cooperating. Like if Serena was here more, like permanently more. Kitchen was very quiet. Then Mason said, "Tyler." "I'm just saying," Tyler said, "because I already know the situation. And I think the situation is pretty good. And I don't think you should keep acting like you're deciding about it." Serena pressed her lips together very firmly. Mason looked at his son. He looked at him for a long moment with the expression that had no management in it, the one that was fully there. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since April," Tyler said, which was extremely specific and therefore entirely credible. "Since April," Mason said. "Margaret the Grillosaurus was in a family," Tyler said. and it was better. That's the whole point of Margaret. There was nothing to say to that. Serena did not try. She sat at the kitchen table in the house on the quiet street and looked at the 8-year-old who had decided in April that the situation was good and had been waiting with the patient certainty of a child who understood something. Adults were still working out, and she felt something that did not have a cleaner name than this. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because anything had been perfectly arranged to deliver her here. Because she had been paying attention when it mattered, and because a man in a parking garage had run toward a problem instead of away from it, and because a child had named a dinosaur Margaret and decided it was better with a family, and because she herself had been brave enough to knock on a door she hadn't knocked on before. Mason looked at her across the table. The honest look. Kitchen look. "I've been thinking about it since April, too," he said to her. "I know," she said. "I keep not finding a reason not to," he said. "There isn't one," she said. He nodded once, slowly, the way he nodded when he had arrived at a conclusion and was committing to it rather than revisiting it. It was not a declaration, and it was not the kind of moment that required music, and the kitchen light was slightly too yellow, and Tyler was scraping the last of his dinner off his plate. And none of it looked like the version that people constructed afterward when they told stories about how things began. It looked like a kitchen on a Thursday in October. It looked like the specific ordinary life that two people had arrived at by way of a December parking garage and several months of kitchen tables and a child who had been quietly and correctly managing the situation since April. The following year carried them forward in the way that years did when the crisis was finished, and what remained was living, which was its own ongoing negotiation, its own daily requirement of showing up and choosing and getting it wrong sometimes and trying again. Mason started a foundation in the spring, a small organization focused on security resources and support networks for vulnerable families and for veterans navigating the transition from service to civilian life, which was a transition he understood from the inside in ways that made him useful to people going through it. He had not wanted to do it publicly and had taken considerable persuading from Serena and Harold Fitch before agreeing that the work required some visibility in order to attract the resources it needed. He ran it with the same methodical competence he brought to everything, with the specific practical focus of someone who was not interested in looking like he was helping, but in actually helping. And the distinction showed in everything the organization did. Serena hired a deputy CEO, a woman she had known for 2 years and trusted, whose presence in the executive structure freed Serena to build toward the company's next phase without being its sole axis. The company grew. Not without problems. There were quarters that fell short of projection, a product development cycle that ran 6 months over and required a difficult internal conversation about priorities, a hiring mistake at the senior level that cost them time and money before it was corrected. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was managed with the organizational health of a company whose executive team was, for the first time, entirely composed of people who were working toward the same thing. She visited her mother in late spring with Mason and Tyler, which was the visit her mother had been waiting for with the patient certainty of a woman who understood that things arrived when they were ready and not before. Her mother put them in the guest room and Tyler in the small bedroom that had been Serena's childhood room, which he treated as an archaeological site, cataloging every item remaining in it with enormous interest. And her mother fed them for 3 days in the way that she fed people when she wanted to say something that didn't have words. On the second evening, while Mason was outside with Tyler in the backyard, her mother came and sat beside her at the kitchen table and looked at her for a moment with the specific assessment that mothers applied to their children when they wanted to see beneath the surface. "He's quiet," her mother said. "He is. The good kind of quiet. Like there's something in there that's thought about things." "There is," Serena said. "And the boy. Tyler. Tyler." Her mother said the name with the warmth of someone who had spent 3 days watching him and had made a determination. "He's already yours, you know. He's decided." Serena looked out the window at the backyard, where Tyler was showing Mason something in the garden with the elaborate explanatory gestures he brought to demonstrations, and Mason was crouching down to look at it at Tyler's eye level, which was what he always did, the physical equivalence of it, the message it sent, about whose perspective mattered. "I know," she said. "Good," her mother said, and that was the whole conversation. Tyler turned 9 in July, with a birthday party in Mason's backyard that involved an inflatable pool and a cake that Serena made from a recipe that had taken 4 test runs to get right and still listed slightly to the left in a way that Tyler declared added character. 8 children from Tyler's class attended, and the afternoon was loud and chaotic and contained no point at which anything was under control. And Mason stood at the edge of it with a soda and watched his son move through the noise of being 9 and alive and entirely himself. Serena came and stood beside him. "You're doing the thing again," she said. "What thing?" "Where you're looking at something, but you're somewhere else." He glanced at her. "I'm right here," he said. "You are now," she said. He put his arm around her, which was a thing he had been doing for months, and which still felt deliberate, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way that things felt when you were aware you were choosing them. When the choosing had not yet become automatic, because you were still paying attention to it, and the paying attention was itself the thing. "You know what Tyler asked me last week?" he said.
What?
"He asked me what the difference was between a family you were born into and a family that came to you." She looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't think there was one," he said. "Not in what matters. That family was the people who showed up when it was required and kept showing up when it wasn't, and knew you well enough to tell the truth about you and still stayed." She absorbed this. "He said that sounded right," Mason said. And then he went back to his dinosaurs. "Good answer," she said. "I had time to think about it," he said. 3 years is a long time to think about things." She understood what he meant. 3 years of a certain kind of stillness, of a life kept deliberately small and deliberate and stable, of waking up every morning and making the choice to hold what was left carefully rather than risk dropping it. 3 years of a son who needed the world to be reliable and the work of making it so. She thought about her own version of stillness, the 6 years of building, of narrowing her world to the dimensions of the thing she was creating, of becoming extremely good at a certain kind of problem and slightly out of practice at others. They had both been, in their separate ways, very competent at living inside a smaller world than they were capable of. What the parking garage had done, ultimately, was not rescue either of them. She had not needed rescuing in that fundamental sense. She was not someone whose life required a stranger to save it from its own direction. And Mason had not arrived in need of someone to restore him to some prior wholeness. They had been, both of them, people with full and functional lives who had simply not been looking when something arrived that was worth looking at. That was the part that she thought about most in the years that followed, when she tried to understand the shape of what had happened. Not the drama of it, not the parking garage or the access logs or the board meeting, though all of that was real and had mattered, but the quieter thing underneath it, which was that 2 people had been paying attention at the right moment and had not looked away. There was no formula for that, no planning it or arranging it or earning it through the right sequence of choices. You could only be the kind of person who didn't look away when something required looking at, and trust that the same was true of whoever happened to be standing nearby. Mason proposed on a Wednesday evening in November, which was not a significant date in any external sense, which was precisely why he chose it. He had never been interested in choreographed moments, and Serena, who had sat across from him in enough ordinary kitchens at enough unremarkable hours to understand what they actually were, would not have wanted one. Tyler was at the table. He had known it was coming. Mason had told him in September, not as a question but as an informing, which was the right approach for a child who deserved to be part of decisions that shaped his world. And he had said, obviously, and gone back to whatever he was reading, which was the best possible response. So when Mason set down a small ring box on the kitchen table between them and looked at Serena with the honest look, the one without management in it, Tyler was sitting 3 feet away, doing homework, and pretending with enormous theatrical subtlety not to be paying complete attention. "I've been in," Mason said, "since before I admitted it. I wanted to say it properly." She looked at the box. She looked at him. "You're asking me," she said. "I'm asking you," he said. She opened the box. The ring inside was simple and specific, and exactly right in a way that required knowing her rather than knowing jewelry. She looked at it for a moment and thought about the parking garage and the graph paper and the kitchen table and a child running toward a security door with a robot box under his arm. She thought about all of it, the whole sequence of ordinary and extraordinary that had assembled itself into this Wednesday in November, And she understood that this was what life actually looked like when you were paying attention, not the grand shape of it from a distance, but the specific accumulated detail of it up close. Yes, she said. Tyler closed his book with the satisfaction of someone whose assessment of the situation had been correct since April. Their wedding was small, which was what both of them wanted, for entirely separate reasons that happened to coincide. 30 people in a space that was warm and real rather than grand. Harold Fitch gave a toast that was 3 minutes long and said more than most people managed in 10. Tyler stood beside his father in a blazer he had selected himself, and which fit imperfectly in a way that made Mason's expression do something complicated when he saw it. It rained, which was outside anyone's plans and which Tyler immediately declared was good luck, based on a fact he had encountered somewhere, and was prepared to cite in detail to anyone who expressed concern. The years carried them forward. Tyler grew in the way that children grew when they were loved well, and allowed to be specific into the particular version of himself that had always been present in the child who named dinosaurs, and corrected anglerfish facts, and told his father to stop acting like he was deciding. He was 12 when Serena's company reached a scale she had imagined in a rented office at 24 and had not been entirely certain she would reach. He was 13 when Mason's foundation expanded into a second city, and then a third, quietly, with a kind of organizational integrity that came from a person who was more interested in the work than in the visibility of doing it. Through all of it, they were imperfect in the ways that people were imperfect when they were genuinely trying. Mason still closed down in ways she had to learn to sit with rather than push against. She still worked too much in the way that people who loved what they were building could not entirely prevent. They had arguments, real ones, the kind that took days to fully resolve about decisions and priorities, and how much space each of them needed, and how to tell the difference between space and distance. None of it was clean. All of it was real. And Tyler, who had known in April what his father was still deciding in October, grew up understanding something that most people took most of their lives to arrive at. That a family was not something that appeared complete or arrived with instructions, but something that was built, imperfectly and persistently, by people who decided to keep showing up. He understood it not because anyone taught it to him explicitly, but because he had watched it happen in a kitchen on an ordinary street, in a school gymnasium in June, on a soccer sideline, and a birthday afternoon, and 100 unremarkable Saturdays that were, in the accumulation of them, the actual substance of a life. The scream in the parking garage had lasted 2 seconds. What it led to took years, and was still ongoing, and was exactly the kind of story that didn't end so much as continue not toward a conclusion, but toward more of itself. More Saturdays and kitchen tables and imperfect dinners and a child who grew into a person and carried in him the specific proof that love was not a thing you possessed or lost, but a thing you practiced, daily, in the ordinary direction of whoever needed you to show up. Mason had run toward the problem. The problem had turned out to be the beginning. And the beginning, as it happened, had no end in sight.